Dominus Deus Sabaoth, veni sunt celia terra gloria.
Celeste is a challenging yet accessible platformer built around the idea of generosity and always manages to stay fresh. We follow Madeline, a young woman who suffers from depression, panic attacks, anxiety. She embodies it all, just how I like it. She meets several influential characters along the way and is introduced to a surprising number of new systems and obstacles each chapter while maintaining the base mechanics for most of the game. That's essentially the foundation of Celeste, a generous game that retains its challenge and never becomes stale, both mechanically and regarding its story and character structure. So let's continue laying the groundwork by discussing what lead developers Matt Thorson and Noel Berry were aiming for. Let's discuss accessibility. They used a word as their guideline, and that word was generosity.
The word that I always think about too, thinking Mario 3 is generous. Like that's
very generous game.
Yeah, and that's also the
that
word.
Exact word to describe this game right here to my buddy a little bit earlier.
That's awesome, because I was just gonna say that's a word we always came back to during development. It was like we wanted to feel generous with like how it doles out mechanics and like the pacing and everything. Like always have more than you're expecting.
Celeste offers accessibility and generosity along the lines of offering more than enough room to maneuver and the idea of multiple approaches.
Our moveset overlaps in lots of different ways. Like all those three moves I talked about give you vertical progress, but they use different resources and have different nuances and trade-offs. So you can approach stuff in a lot of different ways. And when I started designing levels, I didn't really realize how important this was. So I would design something like this challenge with a very specific solution in mind. Like, I think for this one, my solution was the center one. But playtesters never did things the way I wanted them to, obviously. And I just really started to learn the importance of this. And a big part of playtesting now is finding these different solutions and enabling them.
More player control over their approach, less repetition, more wiggle room, less precision, and less trial and error. For instance, extending this platform further down to add some wiggle room seems minor, but having this kind of generosity can do wonders for both enjoyment and accessibility. It's a contributing factor to the game's more lenient nature, and all without sacrificing the challenge. Imagine artificial difficulty elements, like if we had to jump and dash onto the very bottom of this platform if we raised it up. Sometimes you'd make it, other times you'd have to try again by repeating the same action with no change in user input. That's an example of transforming the situation into an artificial trial and error challenge. We can typically associate this with unfairness or just tediousness. Celeste tries its absolute best to steer clear of this, and we'll see how it fares. Speaking of challenge, I do want to go ahead and get this out of the way. Celeste and Super Meat Boy will get brought up as a comparison. They're both tough and challenging games, yeah, but for different reasons, and Super Meat Boy becomes extraordinarily difficult. Celeste is not like Super Meat Boy where you bang your head against the wall until you make it.
I've seen a lot of people say it's kind of like Meat Boy, and I'm like, yeah. I mean, you know, it's a platform game where you...
it's superficially like Meat Boy.
You know, it's contemplative.
And Meat Boy is not. Meat Boy is like more in your face kind of hard. Whereas this is like... it's a different kind of hard, I think.
It's chill hard.
Yeah, chill hard.
Hard like the ice.
Overall, Celeste offers multiple approaches, safety, and generosity that all contribute to accessibility. We'll be diving right into some of these concepts in the prologue even, briefly before Chapter 1. So their design guidelines thus far lend themselves to accessibility. However, despite this, we still have not covered the feature everyone and their granddaddy talks about. Assist mode. Assist mode allows the player to adjust how many dashes are available, how much stamina, the game speed, and even allows skipping chapters entirely. Assist mode can be turned on mid-save. This is how you handle difficulty in a game, not some arbitrary difficulty setting that tells me absolutely nothing. This way, players who want to enjoy the game at a slightly or significantly reduced difficulty can, and without the cost of transparency, whereas most of the time I have to guess which difficulty is the intended one or the difficulty that the game is most tailored to. So now we have both Celeste's innate design and assist mode contributing to Celeste's accessibility. Celeste provides a meaningful challenge and experience for a larger audience, and that's not even taken into account Celeste's character and story development, the exploration aspects, the chapter and area design. It's all very approachable, which is an achievement in and of itself for what's meant to be a challenging game. We're off to a fantastic start already. So let us dive into each chapter and discuss the systems at play, the generosity and multiple approaches conveyed, and how everything develops throughout the game. But first, the prologue. The prologue marks the beginning of a journey. This already tells us something about her character, which isn't apparent until later on, but nevertheless, how many people with anxiety, depression, and/or lack of purpose or drive can truly say they've made it this far? Drove to a mountain to overcome their fears and doubts and to find their purpose, motivation, self-worth, what have you. Madeline is one such person. Right away, we know Madeline is a strong character to have arrived here, at least at heart, since she still has much to learn and develop as a person, such as learning how to cope with different emotions and voices, learning to trust others. There's a whole schlong of different themes that we'll see develop within Madeline, which also happens to translate to the gameplay and environment. So here we are, to establish the very basics of movement, jumping, grabbing, and climbing. Celeste is establishing the most basic yet necessary of controls before continuing to the main mechanic, dashing. The jumping is fairly simple with a fun little block that falls after walking to the edge. The bird tells us how to climb with no threat, then after there's a small platform to catch us to give us some breathing room as we adjust to not only the climbing, but the controls in general. Then there are a couple different routes we can take to finish the room off. The multiple approach motif already at play, giving us variety in the tutorial. Now that we understand the base controls and after we talk to old Grandma Chio, we're placed in a timed sequence, which is one way to logically expand a basic concept we've already learned, and it ends with us learning our primary mechanic, dashing. We'll come back to this instance in chapter 1. Throughout this video, I'll be using these convenient maps that allow me to map out these areas and chapters. If you couldn't tell by the large and inconveniently placed watermarks, they were provided by Neoseeker. I'll have a link in the description. As we'll discover, each and every chapter introduces a, should I say, a generous amount of new concepts. Here's a list of chapter 1s. Wow, that's crazy. Arguably more important, however, is how Chapter 1 sets precedents with its well-conveyed systems and secrets, and establishes its concepts seamlessly throughout their respective rooms. We'll step through every room and system as we venture along, so let's start from the beginning with this previously mentioned idea of generosity and multiple approaches in mind. From the first room alone, look how many ways there are to approach each jump. For the first jump, we can just simply jump, or we can dash across, dash diagonally, dash up, or just climb. For the second jump, we can climb, dash across and climb, dash diagonally, or dash up. For the third jump, we can dash across, dash diagonally, dash up, and even climb. Here we are introduced to combining our jump and dash, but even more, forced to jump and dash, which is important when establishing controls and mechanics. We're given a good amount of wiggle room here to utilize whatever method we please at the moment, as everything is still new to us. And of course, we know what the spikes will do due to affordance, and we can find out that pits kill us right from the get-go if we so desire. I always love having that option in case my self-esteem gets too low. The second room is also significant. This springboard and strawberry work together here. First off, we can assume what the springboard will do due to affordance, similar to the spikes, but it's less obvious because we cannot assume the details like how high or how fast it bounces you. Second off, we now know there are optional collectibles, given that the exit is already open and nothing happens when it's collected besides slipping it into your backpack with clear feedback. The points given don't matter, but having that feedback is nice, and it's better than if the strawberry just disappeared without that satisfying ding. Third off, they work together because even though we can guess what the springboard does, using the springboard to grab the strawberry without risk solidifies its use. Even more so because the player will be more than inclined to grab it, especially with how this level is subtly divided. And of course, there are a couple ways to approach the strawberry. Now, the obstacle itself, you might be thinking, dashing across seems to be the only option. How is that generous or offer multiple approaches? And I would tell you that multiple approaches is only bread or butter, not both. Notice the space in between the spikes and ceiling, enough to force a horizontal dash, but not confined enough to be overly precise. A diagonal dash doesn't give you the distance you need because of this ceiling, so it's trying to promote different ways to approach obstacles, movement, or otherwise achieving distance. This instance is important because it's part of how every dash angle is taught or introduced, as we'll discuss later. Oh, and there are still 2 ways to approach the dash, so there's your bread and butter. At the end, we're moving from the previous room's simple stepping blocks to wall jumping. Simple progression, but consistent in that it's a vertical climb. One might say we're even climbing a mountain. We then move from the basic wall jump introduction with just the 2 walls and no hazards to something that requires timing and avoiding death, but still simple enough. There's also the additional approach from the side, cause why not? This perfectly exhibits Matt Thorson promoting a variety of different approaches, and just so happens to use this room as his example. The link for his GDC talk will be in the description, and I'll occasionally use clips from it in this video. For the strawberry, Celeste dives into escapism. We have to fall and dash in any direction that gets us to a wall, and then we have to climb out, or escape. Celeste has been leading us up to this moment, and now it leaves us stranded to fend for ourselves, forcing us to apply what Celeste has been pressing in the past rooms, if not wall jumping, then just the concept of climbing vertically in some fashion. The wall jumping progression in Chapter 1 starts with wall jumping safely, to wall jumping above a threat, to reacting to a dire situation by wall jumping, to wall jumping with hazards to the left and right in room 4. It's a natural progression, and by that I mean it's rather subtle with how it ramps up the challenge and places you in new situations. We may realize what Celeste is teaching us, but not how, because the applications are so ingrained into the levels themselves and ramp up as such.
And ideally, players from a wide range of skills can play this game, and it'll teach them all how to play it silently, like without them noticing. And through the course of the game, you learn a lot of things this way, right? And at the end of the game, we have callbacks to all those things, and hopefully the player will look back and see how far they've come at that moment, because that's a powerful feeling. Like, it's not unlike looking back from the top of a mountain you just climbed.
The multiple approaches idea is crucial as well, and I would argue that's the primary contributor to this subtlety. You may not wall jump here in room 4, for instance, or even room 3, but nevertheless, wall jumping thus far is a common occurrence that is progressively pushing the player to learn and adapt. The same subtle learning is applied to dashing. The prologue introduces the dash mechanic in a safe environment, since we cannot dash in any other direction but the correct one, and now you not only know about dashing, but also that diagonal dashing is allowed. By enforcing this, it's guaranteed that every player will understand Celeste's main mechanic, and now the player 100% knows that dashing comprises horizontally, vertically, and diagonally. Since if we understand that diagonal dashing exists, then we understand that horizontal and vertical exist. Room 1 involves a simple dash from platform to platform. Room 2 involves an optional vertical and required horizontal dash. Room 3 is essentially saying, hey, you got the basics now, here's something a bit more freeform regarding any direction of dashing as you progress via wall jumping. Room 4 required vertical this time around. Also keeping in mind the majority of players will grab the strawberries thus far, yet this solidifies that the player is trying every dash angle since the player could have skipped out on the optional vertical dash in room 2. That covers all corners. That's all we need, and that's all we get before Celeste strips dashing away in room 5, if you want the flying strawberry, that is. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To really put this learning into context, think about it this way. Celeste could have had one room after another enforcing the dash and the dash alone. That would have been much simpler, much more noticeable, and I would not be discussing this phenomenon at length if the design was that single-minded. Speaking of, in this very room, I've only talked about half of it thus far. It just so happens Chapter 1's main system is introduced here, the traffic light gear platforms. The gear platforms are on a track and have an embedded traffic light, so we can reasonably assume what'll happen based off of the appearance alone. The gear platforms stop quite suddenly, but we do not fly off unless user input is involved, which gives more control to the player. Player control is a common theme we'll see with future systems. This also serves a secondary purpose, almost forcing learning about momentum since we're most likely gonna press jump a bit too early. Of course, this doesn't follow the ever important learning in a safe environment mantra, but hey, it's kind of funny, right? Although, let's entertain the idea of always learning new mechanics or systems in a safe environment to avoid hypocrisy, and because that's a mantra I follow and you'll be hearing about plenty during this video. The most plausible setup that would force learning momentum safely would be a gear platform that moves up while the exit is above. That way we have to use momentum to achieve the height needed, and if we fail, then we'll land right back on the platform. This setup should have been what introduced the idea of momentum, while the momentum spike trap in this room should have been introduced later on as a neat and humorous mix-up. In room 5, these two signs are effective enough at telling us not to dash, but showing 2 signs of Madeline dashing would have been more effective, especially since the consequence of not understanding the concept leads to having to kill yourself to reset the flying strawberry, and not understanding could impact future flying strawberries. I had to explain to a fellow Celeste friend how the flying strawberries worked halfway through the game, so yes, it's possible. Moving past the signs, there's a new mechanic introduced here, crumbling rock platforms. They have cracks in them and the platform comprises several rocks, so it's fairly obvious what they do visually, which, similar to the gear platforms, spikes, and springboards, is important. They crumble after X amount of time when stepped on, and we're introduced to them in an environment that encourages simple platforming, yet is satisfying all the same due to the climbing or wall jumping mixed in. Yes. Regarding the safe environment, the player is most likely to jump from platform to platform without hesitation, and the platforms are visually appropriate and shake upon contact. Oh gosh. If we do fall from any platform, a simple dash is a reliable recovery option. It's a simplistic and relatively safe setup, unlike this death trap. However, it's not completely safe. A rock platform could have been placed at the end of the first or second room, for instance, as a simple introduction. Whoa, what's this shiny glow? I like it, let's check it out. What? A secret room? This room essentially demonstrates one of many variations regarding climbing, wall jumping, and dashing, and thus Celeste starts opening up. which is also clearly conveyed through the fact that there's more than one exit in room 6 for the first time. We know everything we need to know at this point. Oh, except this strangely placed section that looks like it should lead somewhere. I imagine its sole purpose is to show how climbing uses stamina, although it doesn't really convey how wall jumping does not use stamina, which I would argue is much more important. Running out of stamina is a simple concept learned through normal play at the player's pace, and usually it's in some kind of safe environment, or relatively safe at least, so this section feels real out of place. The springboard takes its previous applications and pushes it further yet again. Our first springboard propelled us to grab a strawberry above us, then propelled us so that we had to dash on the way down, and now we have to travel past spikes, then dash on the way down. I can't say whether or not this progression was intentional, but if it is, it's ingeniously subtle. Back to room 6, we see, wait a second, this is more following the lines of what I was just talking about earlier with my proposed idea of introducing gear platforms. This platform doesn't require us to learn about momentum to proceed, but it kinda works for the build-up they're trying to achieve here, which we'll get to once we hit a certain gear platform later in this chapter. For the strawberry, another climb dash mix-up. I'm not going to point out these situations anymore. I think my point about Celeste mixing up its challenges was made. Now, time to dive straight into breakable walls, our first secret, or rather, rooms where the only objective is to grab a strawberry. Sometimes there are other collectibles, such as the cassette tape, and it isn't uncommon to find other secret rooms hidden inside secret rooms, so it isn't always a plain and simple extra strawberry challenge. This adds an exploration aspect to the game where it's not simply just climb to the top. Of course, you can just climb to the top and ignore the exploration aspect, but even then that follows the trek up the mountain theme, which follows the idea of progression based on Madeline's current situation and mood. The difficult climb is a straightforward prerequisite of change or progress. You can also think of it as Madeline's character arc reflecting through the environment itself. Let's take Theo, for instance, as a great example of how Chapter 1 exhibits Madeline's situation. She didn't come here to make friends, at least not intentionally, so it's quite fitting that Theo is off the beaten path and we can just stumble across him rather than finding him at the Momentum campfire. Finding him at the Monument campfire. This is something she needed to accomplish for herself, and so this peaceful end is time she needed to reflect upon her journey thus far. We'll see how each chapter exhibits Madeline's character arc and different themes as we continue. Alright, so now that we've established how Chapter 1's secrets tie into exploration, how exploration was embraced as a product of a mountain's features, and how Theo was introduced as a pit stop, let us continue into what I'll dub as Room 9, where we notice an opening. Well, time to explore. And here's where we're introduced to an entirely new concept, an extension of the dash mechanic, the green energy crystal. This introduction is pretty straightforward. We're forced to dash to reach it, and so we learn what this crystal does. It's not in a safe environment though, so it doesn't promote experimenting with this new concept. This still gets the point across well enough as an overall extension of our primary mechanic, but a safe environment is always better. Beyond that is Theo, whom we've discussed. And the secret room above is simply another springboard application and a slightly more involved energy crystal. Here's another great example to point out regarding multiple approaches. Back to room 9, we see an energy crystal. The left path is the optional one, and so here to the right we have another learning opportunity of the same caliber. It's just a different application. We're forced to use our dash before consuming the energy that replenishes our dash. Neither application conveys how these green crystals replenish our stamina. This is something the game just expects you to eventually figure out. The secret is the same type of secret we were first introduced to, but slightly less obvious with a different texture that we've seen before, instead of a carved out block. This slightly more hidden secret works especially well because the precedent has already been set, and so we are on the lookout for places and walls that look suspicious, but more importantly, suspicious beyond doubt. We'll be talking about the importance of precedent soon. The next room setup forces a dash onto the wall, which only leaves one option, and that is to jump into the crystal to replenish our dash and then utilize said dash. The multiple approaches theme is present because we can dash horizontally or diagonally after the crystal, and it's generous because there's wiggle room in regards to landing the initial dash and grab. However, nothing is quite as significant as the small shelter, symbolizing Madeline avoiding the easy way out, embracing the cold, her loneliness personified. Next room, the focus is on positioning for the gear platform and paying mind to accidentally triggering momentum. The second gear platform doesn't require momentum, but optionally so for the secret, as we've seen before. I won't talk about momentum again until later on in chapter 1, I only mention it now for the segue. Speaking of secrets, this one is pretty well hidden, and now is a great time to make a point about how secrets are handled in Celeste. All too often are there secrets in games that make absolutely no sense whatsoever or otherwise too vague. Games should be self-contained and not require the internet to figure out. Celeste is self-contained except for Blue Hearts, but we'll get there. Celeste is self-contained because the secrets are well conveyed. There's nothing we can't miss as long as we're observant. In this case, we see that there's somewhere to be. If this opening wasn't there, then we'd have no reason to believe that this would be a secret, and the arrow we could just assume was just part of the environment. Okay, so now that we know a secret exists, we have to find a way over to it. However, the only precedent set at this point are breakable walls that differ from their environment enough to be observable. So let's draw our attention to the bright as day arrow pointing up, which is important for conveying that secrets like this exist in the game. The importance of precedents. All too often in games, do we have instances where we realize the game is willing to go to X lengths only to never do that again? Imagine if we just randomly came across a secret in Celeste by dashing into a normal wall. Well, now you'll think, hey, this exists in the game. I'm going to dash into every wall now just in case. It happened once before, so it can happen again. That's an incredibly poor and dangerous design choice that leads to wasted time, frustration, and missed secrets. And overall, it comes to player persistence. In Celeste, however, secrets reward observance rather than persistence. That's why the way Celeste handles precedence is important. That's why Celeste's secrets are fair, and the game itself is self-contained. We don't need a guide to figure out anything except Blue Hearts. So in summary, we know a secret exists, we don't know about the illusory walls, so we're guided, the arrow telling us something is around there, and the way the small area is shaped telling us where this something is. So now the game has set a precedent for illusory walls, including the ever-important suspicious beyond doubt mantra. So let's continue to room 16, because here we'll dive into a problem. This and the next room are straightforward. There are additional applications for the base mechanics with some falling blocks, so they're easy but satisfying, and it gets you to start thinking outside the box a little. Then we'll pop out onto a wood platform and, well, that's it. I mean, we're none the wiser, we're fine to move on. So back to room 16 and right to the secret, which is actually an alternative path. This leads us to a 2 energy crystal room, a crumbling rock and vertical gear platform room, and then a room with the dashing through spaces concept we've explored before, but now with an energy crystal which we have also explored thoroughly enough by now to warrant this mix-up. Finally, it leads out to where we ended up before. This poses a problem. You land back into the room and then realize that you just missed out on this path. And there's no way back because of this conveniently placed wood platform. We've been seeing these around. Their purpose is for jumping through them, which isn't inherently a problem. The problem is when they're used to cover the entirety of an entrance, so backtracking isn't allowed when there's content separated like this. Yes, we can actually backtrack from the secret path, but that's only if we don't go ahead and crumble the rock, which simply is not likely enough to be considered for a reasonable player response. So this problem is setting a dangerous precedent. We know secrets are areas to be traversed or explored before continuing on the main path. We know that we can explore a secret and end up at the same place where we've started. There's a reliability that the game has established. To create a contradictory precedent that says there exist secrets where content is skipped is a dangerous precedent to set. We haven't established a context that a game like Dishonored, for instance, would establish. The idea that there are multiple approaches for a main objective via smaller objectives. Taking one path is understood to nullify the other paths. I can either enter a building via door, window, or rooftop, for instance, or talk to different NPCs, or poison someone's drink. Dishonored has huge replayability through its chapters that are entirely centered around multiple approaches. Celeste is a game that isn't set up to sustain that type of multiple approaches. Celeste's multiple approaches is on an individual level or room basis for a reason. Nobody wants to unwillingly miss out on content, and no area should be cut off from the player when it is not properly telegraphed. Dishonored is properly telegraphed and is built around that concept. Celeste's replayability comes from improvement, secrets, and strawberries. Surprisingly, however, we'll see this kind of split pathing executed well in Chapter 6. In more broad terms, the idea of conveying when the exploration of an area will be cut off is executed extraordinarily well in Chapters 3 and 5. We'll discuss that when the time arises. Now let's discuss one of Matt Thorson's goals, and that is not only for each chapter to have its own story, but for each area and each level. Matt used chapters 2 and 3 as examples of an area telling a story, so we'll come back to that later on. For this room or level in particular, I want to step through the different elements since we have some very useful information from Matt Thorson himself. What he kept in mind, what he changed, all very important design considerations. So here's a continuation of his multiple approaches idea.
But so in general, we want our levels to be permissive because this makes them feel like really dynamic and expressive for players. But you have to draw the line somewhere, right? Because if you can approach everything from any angle, you're not going to challenge the player. And it's really easy to keep, like after every playtest, keep sanding off the corners of your levels until they're not so much levels as they are just like amorphous blobs of content. And Celeste, from like a wider perspective, is supposed to be a hard game, right? It's about climbing a mountain. It's supposed to be challenging. So one thing that's been hard for me is making a hard game without it just turning into this like rigid series of precise inputs the player has to do exactly as I tell them to still let the player be creative, but not make the game easy.
Multiple approaches allows Matt to focus on the story of each level on what's important. Or more simply put, having a single focus for each level makes designing itself more focused, and since the focus is on the story rather than a single mechanic, we get levels that are not abashedly single-minded. So let's continue with this level's story.
So the way I found that balance was to go back to focusing on the story of the level, using the story as an anchor. So for example, the story of this level is that the player has to climb up the side of this block, but as soon as they grab it, it starts shaking and falls. So they have to do it quickly. And then there's these spikes on the left that sort of, the two spikes poking out on the top left. So if you jump too soon, those spikes kill you. So there's the tension of you want to jump, but you have to wait long enough to jump. And then once you get on that ledge, you kind of have to pump yourself up for this like difficult series of jumps to get to the end.
So we've established the story, the feeling of climbing a falling rock and jumping off at the right moment. Here we have the first and second iterations of the level.
And so to show how that story kind of steered us, I just went back in version control. This is the very first draft of that level. And the pieces of that story are all there. Except notably those spikes on the top left aren't there, because it took me some playtesting to realize that that story of climbing up that block wasn't interesting without that tension. So here's the next revision where I added those spikes. I also made these falling blocks like more forgiving. So making that left falling block taller means that you can get onto it with more dash angles. and this makes it more permissive, multiple approaches, right? So clinging to the block, like it was all right to make that block getting onto it easier, because how you get onto that block is not important to the story of the level. Like clinging onto the block and climbing it has to feel precarious, and that's why it's hovering over these spikes. But the story of the level is about climbing up the side of it and jumping off at the right time, right? So making getting onto it more permissive lets us put the spotlight on the part of the level that actually the story we're actually trying to tell. And when the player thinks back to this level, we want them to remember that story, not some like annoying jump at the start of the level.
So as he said before, the story is used as the anchor here. He added spikes to a tiny wall area here to add the tension that the story needed, and he made the act of grabbing the falling platform more generous, which not only followed his idea of multiple approaches, but also focused on the story he was trying to tell. This next problem shows why playtesting is so important.
And then playtesting this, another huge problem comes up, where players just try to skip directly to the second block. And it's actually possible to get to it and grab the side of it, but once you grab the side of a falling block, it falls and you just have nowhere to go and you die. So of course this shouldn't be possible, because it skips that whole story we had set up for the level. And it replaces it with just a really lame one, just like an annoyingly precise jump. But it wasn't enough that it was already impossible. It has to be obviously impossible. Otherwise players just tunnel vision on it and keep going for a surprisingly long time and get really frustrated. So the next revision, just pull these spikes up. This makes it so the player has to dash sooner, and they can't even get close to that block. So they stop trying this after like 1 or 2 tries. And playtesting has also been really important for this, for finding these routes that are impossible but not obviously impossible. Because those really negatively affect the player's experience in this kind of game.
So this situation here is terrible for 2 reasons. 1, there's a potential to completely shift the story that the level is trying to tell, and not in a clever way. And 2, something that's real easy to forget when designing, and that's making impossible scenarios obviously impossible. It's easy to blame the player here, since, hey, there's obviously an easier way to do this, you're being mental. But when players consistently go about a level the wrong way, and of course it's within our nature as people to keep trying over and over, it's the designer's fault and the level should be adjusted accordingly. Matt proceeds to show how it is possible to skip across despite raising the spikes, and how adding this complexity is another step in the level design process.
So it actually is possible to skip the intended path in that level. It's just like really difficult. And this is intentional. This is a pass we do on levels where we try to add these. It's just really important that no one ever mistakes this for the intended path. And like no person on their first time through the game is going to have the skills or understanding of the systems to do this. So I just have like this mental list of different techniques that we never teach the player, and we never require them to use to beat the game normally, but we just like, they're fair game for skips like these.
This especially works because it's just a bonus for speedrunners. The act of jumping from one side to the other and skipping the story is obviously impossible. So again, the difference between the two become clear when compared. There's a great deal to take away from Matt's design process. Much of it is knowing what you want to convey, whether generosity, telling a story, whatever, and I think it really comes down to playtesting. Watching friends and their thought processes, their actions, their reactions. I think Matt Thorson has nailed this process for the most part, and Celeste is proof of that. Celeste is not without its problems, however, so don't you worry about that. So let's continue with secrets, since this room actually continues and demonstrates my point about conveying secrets incredibly well. We have this obvious secret, so this sets the third precedent regarding secrets: small holes. The next small hole secret is, well, in this room actually. Boom! Look at that! 2 aspects of this secret work in tandem. 1, this type of secret was already established, which just so happens to be right above us, so we can expect it to exist. This is important because it makes finding the secret less like, oh, really? Oh? And more like, oh. And 2, it's obvious enough with the whole size and the dash space that it's a secret and not a typical pit that'll just kill you. These two aspects have to work together for this particular secret to be both noticeable enough and fair, otherwise we might not even think to check it out unless by chance. As I've mentioned before, it's much more satisfying to find something by observing or noticing a recognizable instance or pattern than it is to stumble across something by chance or persistence. Now, in the very next room, we can go ahead and hit multiple approaches again. It's been with us throughout the chapter thus far, but I don't want to articulate the same points in every single room we come across. So here we can jump off the wall or dash onto the first platform, use the two walls as leverage to jump or just dash to the second platform, and then either use momentum or dash to make it to the end. Now, let's talk about the room where most players stop trying for the strawberries. This room finally, 100% for sure, shows that we can hang on the sides of gear platforms and that we can expect such a use for those who skipped secret rooms. The strawberry, however, is a mix-up for players who have been hidden the secret rooms, which is why so many players end up coming back to it at a later playthrough. The secret rooms in question are the rooms where vertical platforms and hopping from said platforms were utilized. Here we are, back to momentum at a place that requires learning momentum? What? Finally? So I mentioned earlier that Celeste is trying for a build-up approach, and that approach would be to have an accidental discovery instance where the player could discover momentum, but it isn't required or necessary in any context. Then have an optional instance where the player could discover momentum for a strawberry or otherwise secret, and then a mandatory instance that requires momentum from the player. Except that it doesn't work, especially when we step through the rooms thus far that contain gear platforms. From accidental discovery to optional discovery to accidental, optional, optional, and finally mandatory. It's strange that there are so many optional uses of momentum and ways to make mistakes and die before Celeste is like, okay, now is a good time to make sure you know how momentum works. Now is a great time in an environment that rewards a failure to learn with death. Sure, there's merit to a design philosophy centered around accidentally discovering concepts or mechanics before being taught those said concepts or mechanics, but when players see secrets like in room 14 that require momentum and don't happen to know about the concept yet, then it's rather unfair. Yes, we could possibly say that most players will have stumbled across momentum and learned how to utilize it by now. Whether or not that's true is up to debate. However, it doesn't matter, since both the discovery and the ability to perform the action is not yet a certainty for any room before this room. The room itself poses another problem. It doesn't convey its potential paths very well. There are 3 exits, yet we can't say for certain which is the main path and which are the side paths. Generally, going up is the main path, which makes sense given we're climbing a mountain. However, there are rooms where the path isn't up, but to the side. Just like the side path here, and the side path to the left is also technically up. It's simply unclear. Now that we 100% know for sure about momentum, how do the gear platforms develop this new yet technically not so new concept? Well, momentum is needed for this flying strawberry. Okay, fair enough. It's an application that is standing rather than grabbing. On the left side path we have, well, there's our learning tool. In the GDC Talk with Matt Thorson, he explains how this room was for those who could not figure out momentum and how to utilize it to cross the gap. I still don't think it works very well, since failing at momentum is not the player's fault if the game hasn't firmly established the concept, but ignoring my previous complaints, we can at least say this room and the next are very well laid out. Coincidentally enough, momentum is taught here exactly as I've explained. It's absolutely necessary to make it to the top. We also have spikes as a constraint that forces vertical movement and removes horizontal from the equation. Keeping in mind the objective is to make it to the wood platform, but the intent is to teach momentum, we can simplify how we proceed to our objective to better convey our intention. The spikes are not an issue regarding a safe environment because they're not an active threat. For instance, if we fail in the previous room, we die. If we fail here, we just try again. There's no need to gather up your bones. If we proceed, we'll find a similar situation but with a threat involved. The ingenious aspect here is the fact that we have to dash to be able to grab the gear platform, so we're forced to use momentum, but even more, it's clear that momentum needs to be used here, and thus solidifies the concept. Oh, and regarding this hidden light, we've already established what light means, so yeah, this is sneaky and leads to a wonderful platforming challenge set to music. These cassette tapes open up their respective chapters B-side, which are more difficult levels. We'll briefly discuss the B-side some hours from now. If we walk to the left from the momentum gear, we find a room that's another springboard application. I only mention this room because there's a fun fact regarding this patch of grass.
Is the grass there intended as a marker of how long your dash is? Because
I think it was originally. It's been a while since I designed these levels, but like years, but
even this cliff strawberry has multiple approaches. Cut out the bottom portion of this cliffside and multiple approaches is lost. Now, here we'll see a strawberry if we miss it with no way to backtrack. I understand that we've passed the area by now, but taunting the player like that could be frustrating, especially if the player thinks there's a secret in the room they're in. Imagine if, in Dark Souls, we see an item that we've already passed and can't get back to it. Dark Souls loves to show places where we'll be able to reach later on using these bright white item drops.
Oh, so what do we see here?
An item that I can't get to.
Right, and what does that mean?
That means I can probably get to it some other way.
Right.
Probably.
It's this promise of sooner or later you will be able to get to that item, and you'll notice that Dark Souls, the whole series, does this a lot. Lets you know you can get places by putting items in your view and sort of challenging you as a player or driving you as a player to figure out how to get those things. Right? There's a promise. It's telling you, hey, look, here's a place you can get. They do this a lot. It's a really good technique of theirs.
Celeste is taking an opposite approach here. I don't like it. What I do like is this fun little mix-up regarding momentum, which is the same as dear old Room 4. But this time it's warranted, now that we've actually learned momentum. The secret in the next room is well hidden, yet is nothing new. It's a variant of room 14, the difference being the exit is not as noticeable. An illusory wall is also involved this time, but it's directly connected to the exit. Room 14 was a nice way to ease the player into this type of secret, since this will certainly be unexpected for the majority of players, having to notice the space here. We're then brought to a room that expands the momentum idea. First, we learned about momentum, both horizontally and vertically, if we're including the bonus areas. Then there's a mix-up where we have to recognize that momentum here will kill us. And finally, instead of one platform, we have two platforms as a way to expand the idea after exploring some single platform avenues. Wow, what a climb thus far. We've learned about dashing, gear platforms, strawberries, crumbling rock platforms, multiple types of secrets, precedents, multiple approaches, and how the themes of this chapter match up with Madeline's current situation. Chapter 1 also exhibits generosity at every turn, well, except this tight situation that leans more toward trial and error, but otherwise nothing exhibits brute force or trial and error, and for that, I like this game so far. Oh, and from now on, we're getting into spoiler territory. I'm not going to go step by step through the story, just enough for context to establish areas and environments. I will be discussing Madeline's character throughout the chapters, and there is heavy spoiler territory in chapter 6 and onward. This is the only spoiler warning I'm giving. You know, I was gonna put more spooky Madeline dialogue here, hence the increase in volume, but I just noticed how there's a mic bump at the end of this jingle file that I just played. That's pretty funny. If Chapter 1 embodies the idea of trekking up a mountain, then Chapter 2 is exploring a dreamscape. I know that sounds like polar opposites, but like how Chapter 1 established the beginning of her physical journey, Chapter 2 establishes how the mountain is starting to pull at her mental strings. We're establishing the inner conflict here that ends up manifesting as an external conflict. And that's a reason why the environments end up as compelling as they are, because Madeline's inner demon isn't just personified. Each chapter or even area is built around Madeline's entire journey. The chapter starts out with Madeline jumping into her mind, which is clear symbolism, straight into a strange mystical labyrinth. We begin to see how open this area is compared to chapter 1's linear trek, especially when we take a look at the area map. It's small, but still noticeably different from anything we've seen before. Here we see an emphasis on simply exploring this unknown and mystical dreamscape, the music guiding us, until we reach progress that acts like a secret or alternative path, as if her mind is protecting herself from the more dangerous side of said mind. It's also important to establish here what I said in the introduction regarding Madeline's current situation. She is able to motivate herself enough to travel to a mountain to possibly find some answers about, well, something. Not even she knows, but this fact makes even her character accessible. How so? Well, we know Madeline isn't so far down the rabbit hole as to lack all motivation and desire for improvement or answers. The fact of the matter is, she drove however many hours or days to arrive at this mountain, no matter how much she struggles to hold herself together. This way, we're able to see development with a character that different themes can be stable to, in an environment that acts more like a metaphor than anything. This makes her character arc easier to follow for the general audience. Her character is accessible, which is quite fitting for this game. Okay, so now that we know where Madeline stands as a character, boom! The mirror that personifies her demons or certain negative emotions is buried in the corner of her mind. Once we interact with said mirror, the demon pops out and escapes. Celeste could have explored two different avenues at this point. For one, Celeste could have played at the fact that this perceived evil entity is now out there somewhere. This idea could have been utilized for a more suspenseful, maybe horror-esque type of area until we find her for the chase sequence. However, this is incredibly difficult to pull off, especially in a game like Celeste that wasn't built around that type of atmosphere from the beginning. Just take a look at Little Nightmares, a game that experiments with suspense and simply cannot sustain itself. It's not easy. I have a video examining Little Nightmares for those who are interested. And so Celeste went with the second option, maintaining its dreamlike atmosphere and simply not focusing on the demon that just escaped, which makes sense because this whole area acts as a framework, which we'll come back to that. Either way, this approach becomes immediately apparent when the music picks up. The area completely opens up with this chapter's primary mechanic, dream blocks. These are used as an extension of our dash. We now have a means of traveling further that replenishes our dash, so it has the utility of an energy crystal, but it's restricted to the angle at which we've entered, and they can only be entered by using a dash. Notice how imbalanced these properties are. The dream blocks are useful but restrictive, and that allows Matt to really draw out the nuance in this system while designing levels. So the area opens up, and now that we have this extension of our dash, such means to traverse this more open dreamscape, we travel from thought to thought, questioning, exploring our own mind, desperate for answers, yet picking our mind apart as represented by the seeds introduced in this chapter. I'm probably looking too far into it, but hey, somebody has to do it. Alright, so now that we've established the mind games, the main mechanic, and the overall dreamscape, let's slow down and start from the beginning because there's something significant going on here before we even fall into her mind. This light. So chapter 1 tries to convey the idea of secrets or side paths by making the first side room glow with light. This occurs only twice in the entire chapter, here and the secret entrance to the cassette tape room. Chapter 2 tries to take this entrance light idea and completely flip it by making it the main intended path rather than secrets or side paths, which is the polar opposite of what has already been established. If we take a look at the map, here is the entrance we were just looking at, and up here we can see another light entrance. Using this dream block we can access both this light and this area, but which one is the main path and which one is the side path? It's not entirely clear. Yes, the chapter establishes what the light means at the beginning, but the game does not. The game is contradicting itself at this point. It's frustrating to accidentally miss a secret when it's not clear which path leads to the secret. The fact that the main path is harder to reach means nothing because we see harder to reach paths being used as secrets as well. There's nothing that makes this okay. Okay, so now we fall into the light to find everything dormant. We can explore this room with these mysterious seeds, and we might notice the breakable floor in the corner, which leads to a secret that we can only obtain if we notice before falling into the next room. If this secret is noticed below, then we can find the room above, but this setup is a bit more well-paced because we can't find the room above if we've fallen. Instead, we have to continue onward and come back later. We can travel up and to the right, and if we do, we find these binoculars that allow us to see the mirror below. If we weren't allowed to climb up to this path, then this main path that acts as the dangerous area of her mind would be too obvious. I mean, it's still obvious, but it's more effective because there are two paths here rather than one. Alright, so mirror, mirror, on the wall is the bad Madeline. We've already discussed about this brand new concept of dream blocks, but how is it taught to us? Well, we've got nowhere to go except up. If we head back the way we came, this is why backtracking isn't allowed here. It makes sense, cause otherwise the player might follow the creature from the Black Lagoon. This dream block introduction is especially well designed because we cannot interact with it in any other way. We can't jump, grab, climb, nothing. We have one option, dashing up. On top of that, we know immediately that the dream blocks are solid and can be walked on just by landing on top of it. Our second dream block here is a variety show. We might dash into the wall on the upper side and die. We might get crushed by the dream block below. But I would say more likely than not, players are going to take the obvious path and just dash through to the other side. There's nothing here to guarantee learning anything, although how would you teach something like dying against a wall? At the very least, we can assume what'll happen in both scenarios when standing in this room, so really this is a visual experience more than anything. And for that, it succeeds. In the next room, there's a block's height of open space above the dream block, and that's where a secret lies. This type of twist on the illusory wall secret is fine, but this is our third dream block. I would have preferred to see more time establishing the dream blocks before sneaking in secrets like this. Chapter 2 is pretty short-lived though. There's not much time to really flesh out the dream blocks. Alright, so we make our way to the other side, and we can now grab these seeds. We have to grab all three without ever touching the ground to collect our strawberry prize. This kind of secret is perfect for dream blocks, as airtime can be kept via these blocks, unlike Chapter 1 systems, where you have to land back on the gear platform if you want more airtime. So it's strange to me how this concept is only used once in Chapter 2. We'll discuss the seeds in future chapters. So up toward the entrance and to the right, let's demonstrate some multiple approaches and secrets. We have a wall grab option for some slight variation. There's a secret in this room, a small hole in the floor that we must dash through a block to get to. We can leave by dashing back. Oh, I guess our only option is to fall into a previous room, so we have to take a longer path back around? I don't really understand this one, it's just wasting the player's time. In the next room we can take either direction with some options in terms of dashing angles. If we return to the entrance, we can now use this big honky block to check out this secret, where I can demonstrate another multiple approaches situation regarding dash angles, and then we can return to the honky block to travel to the light. The first room through the light expands the dream block concept by introducing the idea of using the same block consecutively. Dream blocks are used in this way during the chase, so it's nice to have a little moment to open our minds and think outside the box. Sometimes players need that push to really start thinking about mechanics, disregarding the fact that we're coming up to a chase scene, so it's an almost a necessary precaution to avoid trial and error learning. Speaking of chase, now the dark side of Madeline makes her appearance. We've talked about storytelling regarding levels in Chapter 1. Chapter 2 was built around this upcoming chase sequence and is a great storytelling example regarding areas.
When I'm arranging the areas, I'm really thinking about the story of each level and where it fits into the area's story. And because our areas can be non-linear, we have to think about, bottlenecks for narrative, like cutscenes, and also for teaching. And it often feels like arranging a song, because so much is about pacing and framing. And you want to do something cool with like the overall structure of the song, but you always have to be aware of whether your melody can support that structure. So, an example, the initial concept for this area was just a simple boss sequence where you're being chased by like a dark version of yourself. You go up the left side of this tower and back down the right side. And I designed this really cool chase sequence, and these are actually some of my favorite levels in the game, but what surprised me here is how, as a story, when it was done, it just felt very flat. So to make a satisfying story out of this chase, we had to add all of this framing around it. And in the end, most of this area is just there for framing. Just to like foreshadow and ramp up to the chase and give it context, and then properly cool down from it and move the narrative forward in a satisfying way.
So that's how this chapter was constructed. Now let's get to the chasing. First off, how does Dark Madeline act?
She follows like your exact movements from like 3.5 seconds ago or so.
Simple enough. The chase follows a common theme, intersecting paths. The first and second strawberries and the transition in between exhibits this. The second strawberry also introduces spikes on dream blocks. This opening that leads to the strawberry and the way this room is angled pushes the player to the right after dashing through. Even below this dream block though, we're required to move right to encourage the thought process. If we continue, there are more instances where our paths intersect. What? What is that? It's an entirely new concept that is being introduced in an environment where we're being hunted. What's interesting is that this actually works incredibly well due to its simplicity. We see a door and a button with matching color and symbol. If we follow the natural path laid out in front of us, we'll hit the doorbell, see the door move, and immediately know what to do, if you haven't figured that out already. This is simply telling us, move here before moving there, which yet again intersects our path with ourselves. What helps to prove the intent I just described is the next room, moving directly from one doorbell to a whopping 4 doorbells. This concept exists solely to get Madeline moving through a room, rather than just a simple point A to point B chase. There would be a lot less tension. This idea of these intersecting paths with the doorbells marking points of interest really sells the first half of this area during the climb. Celeste is trying to make the most of its space and get us to move strategically, and it works. We intersect here, then move into a split using a single dream block. We can either climb to the side path, or dash through and grab the strawberry, or trigger the block if you don't care about strawberries. There's a good amount of choice variety in the single room alone. As we proceed, yet again, we intersect paths, but this time in a tighter space compared to the first and second doorbell rooms. The second half of the chase switches gears for a moment, the focus less on positioning and more on tension by trying to lessen the distance between you and your dark self. The falling block here makes sure of that, and then a crumbling rock platform maintains the tension. As we continue, there are more crumbling rock platforms that slow us down yet again, keeping us anxious. Lastly, a final doorbell area that intersects our paths in tight hallways. This raises the tension because there are 5 Madelines now, and therefore we have to wait longer for them to move out of the way, which means the distance is lessened yet again. After Darky disappears, we wind down throughout the rest of the chapter. Well, except for a couple secrets along the way.
And then we have this cooldown section with easier levels, ending with like a cutscene where the main character realizes she's dreaming and kind of resolves the chase for now. It took me a long time to realize that this area shouldn't have any risk of death. Like at one point, like a couple weeks ago, I just went through and deleted all the spikes from these levels, and they got way better. Just to keep the player engaged after such a crazy like challenge, we just had to like dial down the difficulty way down to 0. And then finally, your character wakes up, and this is just a really simple section where you run through a bunch of the same levels, but they're all subtly different, like none of the dream elements are there. And this gives us space for some like optional NPC dialogue, and also gives us a nice like calm ending to this like roller coaster of an area.
We wake up at our campfire, soon interacting with Theo yet again. If we continue to the left, we'll notice an oddly placed platform. The way this is spaced out is reason enough to assume something is over to the left. Here is where Celeste completely fails to teach. So ideally, we would discover a dash property that we haven't encountered yet. Passing the edge of the screen acts as an energy crystal. Climbing to the top, we find a blue heart and a poem telling us to go back to the dream world and use what we just learned. That's ideally. What actually ends up happening is that we don't learn about this dash property. That's it. We just don't learn it. We can dash once between screens at the beginning and climb without ever needing to learn what we need to learn. So Chapter 2's Blue Heart is frustrating. It's an accidental find at best, which is surprising since Celeste is fantastic at conveying secrets. To conclude, Chapter 2 adds more open areas to its linearity to simulate a portion of her mind as framing for the chase sequence that occurs after evil Madeline is personified. The area itself opens up after the mirror and activating these dream blocks, so there's a gradual shift in the environment that lends itself well to pacing. The dream blocks are a great new way to traverse areas, but they're not fleshed out nearly as much as they could be. Despite this, multiple approaches is still as strong as ever. The chase sequence expands on the dream blocks and also introduces doorbells as a way to bounce the player to different spots within a single room. Doorbells are a great pacing tool that utilizes space effectively. We then descend into tension and tight corridors, again utilizing space effectively with Darky and the doorbells. And finally, we're given time to breathe and a little bit of sweet Theo time.
Just look in the mirror and don't know what looking is looking at me.
Chapter 3 takes place in a hotel with a spooky hotel ghost that desperately wants Madeline to stay in a room for the night and does everything he can to make her stay. And I mean everything. Offering her the presidential suite, taking advantage of her good nature so she'll clean the clutter, and tries to kill her by leaking depression. This chapter explores different reactions people have regarding helping others. Madeline is willing to help and to understand Oshiro, at least on a compassionate level. Theo is afraid and just wants to find a way out, encouraging Madeline to join him. Dark Madeline sees that they're being taken advantage of and encourages Madeline to not waste her time with him. Theo and Darky are willing to abandon Oshiro while Madeline wants to help. All he needs is a little bit of compassion, and yet Darky tells Oshiro the harsh truth in her own mean way, of course, but whether or not anyone knew it, Oshiro needed to hear it. We see this at the end of the chapter where he needs time to reflect before deciding to turn his life around. Afterward, we come across the old lady with her own take with the wisest perspective of them all. So that's an example of how Madeline and Darky are two pieces of the puzzle. How Madeline needs to grow as a person but cannot until she learns how to cope with that side of her, rather than just wondering why Darky won't go away. That's a central plot point regarding her character arc that we'll see develop, especially toward the end of the game. What allows us to see this dichotomy is Oshiro. He's built to draw out certain emotions as to set up or establish their differences, especially since we see it in action. Actions depict people's true natures. Chapter 3 really wants to establish its main concept right out of the gate before we even reach the hotel. All this darkness and these moving blobs with red outlines. Neoseeker calls the darkness Mr. Oshiro's darkness, but I do think a more accurate term would be Mr. Oshiro's depression. Sure, it's dark stuff that he craps out, but you gotta think about the root cause here. He probably needs to watch what he's eating. The first two critters are timed jumps. The first is from the ground, where the only factor to consider is the critter's vertical positioning. The second is from a springboard, so now there are two factors to consider: the vertical positioning of both the critter and yourself. After the critters, we can make our way up to a strawberry, where the only possible solution is to move off screen and use the dash property we mentioned at the end of chapter 2. This doesn't change anything. It's a completely separate chapter at this point, and this dash property is never used again in the entire game. Chapter 3 comprises more smaller platforms than the previous chapter, so here we're establishing an important concept: jumping from one side of a platform to the other. This has been hinted at in previous chapters, but now we're setting up for the real deal. More importantly, however, is this idea of finding keys to unlock the main path. This lock and key premise is introduced in this chapter and is fleshed out further in chapter 5, both functionally and thematically. Functionally, the idea of requiring an object to proceed down the main path is one of the best methods for establishing progress, or more specifically, a point of no return. Of course, there are other, perhaps simpler methods to convey a point of no return, but having to search for a key plays well into Celeste's exploration aspects that we've seen hinted at in chapter 2. Thematically, I mean, it's a closed and rundown hotel. It makes sense that the front door is locked since Oshiro is a ghost and probably can't pick up keys. Whoops! Which means we're the first guest to arrive. Whoops, I guess not. So really, it doesn't make sense why any of these doors are locked. No wonder he doesn't have guests. Either the doors are locked or he kills them with his weaponized depression. So in the next room we have some critter variety that ends with a falling platform, so you better jump past that critter quick, boy. Although there isn't any way to discern whether or not this block is a falling block, which is fine. Falling platforms were well established in both chapters 1 and 2. At this point, the concept is being used to keep us on our toes. The critter is expanded yet again, similar to the springboard application, except this time we control the height as we both position ourselves accordingly and try not to fall into the depths of Oshiro's depravity. This new sink-in platform is intuitive like the gear platform because of the track behind it. This room also houses our first lock inside the hotel. If we head up, critters are on the walls, the floors, oh no! And here's where we find the key. This is why I love the idea of this lock and key system, because hey, we never have to worry about being cut off and not being able to backtrack, right chapter 1? So if we continue with the side path, we grab onto falling blocks, and crumbling rock platforms are introduced here as another way to add tension as a timing element and a way out if you don't notice this illusory ceiling. There's this path here that leads to... that's kinda neat. Kinda shows how connected this chapter is. Then we have a room that is, ideally, all about climbing up and wall jumping on limited stamina and then sliding down through gaps while out of stamina. The only way the story could work though is if dashing wasn't allowed during the climb or fall, since that would trivialize the wall jumping. That's why we have this entrance that forces a dash and leaves us climbing for our lives. For the fall, we're forced to one side so that we can execute wall jumps as we're out of stamina, so the relief comes at actually landing rather than the fall itself. The energy crystal is placed so that it forces the player to descend before ascending. We're dangerously close to the bottom here, and we have to maintain a balance that grabs the energy without hidden depression. Oh, that hit a little bit too close to home. This also demonstrates generosity from the fact that if we mess up, we can start over from the bottom by regaining our energy. This is a different type of generosity, but it works because it's essentially the same as just starting the player over before the entrance. This way, we're saving time, plus the player is in this scenario for a longer period of time. All of these aspects have to work together to tell a story, and the story is told incredibly well. Ideally. This story suffers from one central flaw. You have to really try if you want to run out of stamina by the time you reach the fall. I purposely ran my stamina out before falling, and it really is a different feeling. It's a completely different feeling. Like I said before, the relief should come at landing rather than the fall itself. Finally, we have a crystal mix-up, with multiple approaches of course, that ends with our exit and the strawberry that we could see from the hotel entrance. This is a much more appropriate use of out-of-reach strawberries compared to the poor implementation we witnessed in Chapter 1. As our reward for unlocking the door, we come across these worm-like depressions. These worms are one of the two most misunderstood concepts in the game. Most people, myself included, will think that they create depression after X amount of time upon contact. The truth is, they create depression after moving, so we can stay on them however long we want. Look at that. I'm not moving. This is never conveyed at all in this chapter, and I found it out by accident during the Chapter 3 B-side. An example of how to fix this could be some character like Oshiro, Darky, or Theo could have been standing on some worms, and then the depression forms once they move, signifying that it's not time-based. It could have been a funny Theo moment even. If we scan across this in the next few rooms, we'll see quite the vertical platform theme ending with a flying strawberry. Here we have a second locked door, and as we continue above, where we see some hints of what I generically dub as the critter problem. The critter problem is simple. Critters are a system that can easily devolve into luck or trial and error. We begin to see this problem here, where we have to wait until we can dash safely. Once we find the groove, we can dash through fairly smoothly on instinct, but it's more about figuring that out through trial and error rather than planning, especially with the rate at which they move. This room does not actively support multiple approaches and is rather tight in execution. This room doesn't show the extreme sides of the critter problem, however. It's not immediately apparent what kind of symptoms this room is showing until we play the B-side. This chapter's B-side actually made me reevaluate my love for this game despite being optional content. That's how awful it is. It is absolutely awful. I'm not gonna dive into the B-sides in this video, but if you play Chapter 3s, you'll find that the critter problem boils down to, at some point, it becomes impossible to predict them, especially once you're already midair. These critters either move so fast or there's so many or both that it's completely unreasonable, and thus it becomes a trial and error mess. Back to the normal Chapter 3, we also see the critter problem in a secret corridor in the same area. These critters are moving at an unreasonable speed. However, there is a space in between for us to dash through, but the way this is set up supports a more trial and error jumping through approach rather than dashing through. If this top critter was just solid depression instead, then it would more strongly support the dash approach. Let's move on past the critter problem and take a look at the area as a whole. Sinking platforms, critters, vertical platform jumping, worms, depression itself, crumbling rocks, doorbells, springboards, energy crystals. Wow, this area exhibits Celeste pretty well in terms of variety. Each chapter not only introduces a plethora of new ideas, but ideas from previous chapters are thrown in everywhere. Alright, so I'm not hitting individual rooms in this next section. There's a theme here that was executed very well for the most part that I want to focus on instead. The theme is cleaning up the clutter for Mr. Oshiro, or more specifically, how each of the colored clutter is cleaned up from all 3 paths as we progress. Speaking of, there are 3 paths we can take. There are actually 4, but one leads to the original Game Jam version of Celeste. The top path leads to the green clutter, the middle to the purple, and the bottom to the brown. That's quite the symbolism there. The idea on the surface level is to clean up the central room for Oshiro, and the key can be grabbed once everything is clean. The not so obvious idea, and one that I never even noticed, is how cleaning up one type of clutter will affect other paths. So let's take the purple clutter for instance. Taking the purple path first will make the green path more difficult because there's no longer any purple clutter to help out. Such as this room, where the purple clutter is the difference between not having to dash and having to dash. All 3 paths have clutter from the other 2 paths, so this was a novel idea fully realized. However, this idea is never conveyed as this in-depth as actually affecting different paths depending on the order. The top green path could end up more difficult for the player without them ever even realizing it. It's not easy to appreciate something like this when it's hardly noticeable. Like I said, I don't think I would have noticed this if it weren't for me producing this video. The blue heart is also in this area. When we start on our purple path quest, we find Theo, and right above we find a secret that is blocked by purple clutter. So you think to yourself, I wonder what's there. I'm gonna go unclutter the purple stuff and come back around to the entrance. Nope. You can't do that because it becomes blocked off, and so you're forced to restart the area because there was no way for you to know that you wouldn't be able to go back to where you met Theo, which makes no sense whatsoever. Even worse, if you complete the purple path last, like I did, you might think that the paths become blocked after completing all 3, so you might try to restart the area, making sure you complete the purple path first or second. A solution to this problem could have been to have the entrance blocked off immediately after entering, so it's clear to the player that they cannot re-enter. Having to restart the chapter or area to try and figure out this blue heart is trial and error and frustrating. Besides that, finding the route back through the path is actually pretty neat. On our way down, we see some oddly placed purple stuff, then after clearing the clutter, we have to dash through some water, and from there, we can retrace some of our steps. I think it would have been even more clever and satisfying if we had to play through the entirety of the purple path in reverse, but this time may be more challenging since the purple clutter is all cleaned up. That, on top of the blocked entrance solution I offered up, and Chapter 3's Blue Heart could have been a magically satisfying one. Alright, so I want to set up the next area with some help from Matt Thorson.
So for example, in this area, the player is helping an NPC clean out an abandoned resort. But the guy you're helping is kind of messed up and he's not really appreciative or and he's kind of trying to trap you in the resort as you're doing this. And this highlighted part is you're on the home stretch and the levels are picking up in difficulty, and your character's starting to get frustrated with this guy, and getting frustrated that she's being roped into helping him. And at the end of this part, there's a narrative beat where she snaps at him. And our goal is to make that emotional transition happen on the player's side as much as possible, to make them feel why am I going to all this trouble for this guy? He better give me something good for this. And by the end of it, hopefully you're done with that guy's shit.
This is a great example of how an area can be built around a story, just like chapters and levels. There's something else going on in this area though, that is due to this buildup. Longer levels. In regard to level length, we come across a couple rooms much longer than usual, so now is a great time to discuss length. And what better way than from Matt Thorson himself yet again.
So using the idea of safety is probably the biggest way I control the pacing of levels in Celeste. So a level with hard moves but safe holds between them feels very different from a level with a lot of easy moves but no safety between them. And we can have different kinds of safety and we can give optional safety out of the way. There's a lot of ways to use this idea to make levels more dynamic and varied and interesting. And this level is an example of one where there's safe resting spots between every move, but the moves themselves are very difficult and the level's long, so it makes it really slow, tense experience. So most of the levels in Celeste are very short. We just want to avoid repetition. There's a lot of single screen stages. The game doesn't have any checkpoints really. If you die, you just go back to the start of the level you just were in. And players die a lot, obviously, it's a hard game. And they'll be repeating stages a lot. So we just don't want to take away player progress very often. But thinking about length ties into the idea of safety, because anytime the player reaches a spot of complete safety, where they're just standing on solid ground with no danger, we have to question why we aren't just ending the level at that point. And if we ever decide not to end the level, the reason is to raise the stakes. The longer a level is, the higher the stakes are because you lose more progress when you die. And high stakes really change the feel of a level and really amplify the difficulty of everything because of stress. We just have to really make sure that long levels can support repetition, especially the start of them. So in general, levels get longer as the game goes on, but throughout the whole game, we have a few like very long levels that we use carefully and like sparingly, mostly for like pacing at like really intense story moments to make it more memorable.
That's quite the behind the scenes look with a great guideline to follow. If the player reaches a spot of safety, question why the level isn't ending at that point. It's important to realize that these longer levels are the exception, never the rule. It's all part of conveying the story through the gameplay itself. This area is actually pulling a double whammy. These slightly longer levels are not only escalating with our impatience with Oshiro, but it's also prepping us for the next section, a boss chase. Whew, spooky. The long level before the presidential suite mixes in safety between each challenge. Safety allows us to see clear progress and minimizes the critter problem. It also just so happens the critters here don't move at unreasonable speed, so that's pretty nice. Multiple approaches also makes an appearance. This is the type of clever design that should take precedence over the critter problem's artificial challenge. The last thing we need are the mimics from Prey on crack. So once we reach the presidential suite, Darky shows up as we've discussed and abuses him. Darky breaks through the ceiling without a care, Oshiro pops out, and even though Madeline herself is nice to him, Oshiro just ignores everything except that he's pathetic, even though Darky is the one who said that, not Madeline, and Darky said that they're both pathetic, not just Oshiro, and he never groveled at her feet. All of this felt extremely contrived for the sake of a boss fight. Yes, people who aren't well adjusted with themselves will often lash out at others for no good reason, and oftentimes it has nothing to do with the victim, so it makes sense from a character perspective, but there are just too many elements that don't make sense here. It still feels contrived, or at the very least, oddly convenient. So this leads us to the boss section. This section is a series of progressively lengthier levels designed to heighten the stakes and the stress, as Matt said. However, lengthier levels like this could end up frustrating, but Matt has incorporated a few tactics to help combat this. The overall idea is to avoid repetition. If the player is going to be replaying a longer level over and over, it cannot feel needlessly repetitive. The first tactic is to avoid waiting, such as waiting for a platform to approach. Never make the player wait at the start of a level. The mechanics behind critters can have that tendency if not handled correctly, more so than any other system in the game, but they're fine here, as we'll see. The second tactic is collectibles. Strawberries are not banked at the end of a level or room, they're banked once at a point of safety. This means that strawberries can be placed throughout longer levels as a way for the player to make permanent progress as they try over and over. If a level feels like a bit of a grind, we can at least feel satisfied that we're making progress in some fashion other than making it further each death. The third tactic is multiple approaches, to have obvious paths in the early parts of the level, but then there's a faster way we can discover after replaying the early parts, which is important because that's going to be the most played part of a longer level. As we've discussed, Matt doesn't use lengthier levels often, but when he does, he tries to execute them with these tactics in mind to make the journey worth it rather than frustrating, or even tedious. For the door level, there's nothing to keep us waiting. After the first doorbell, we'll take the obvious wall jump route, but then as we die, we'll transition to the quicker route. And finally, a strawberry to establish permanent progress in the middle of the level. For the last and longest level, there's almost waiting, but the critter moves slow enough to where it's a breeze to get through quickly and consistently. There's a strawberry for permanent progress. There are no quicker alternative paths like in the doorbell level, but there are plenty of multiple approaches. The first we see here with a sneaky little path. Most of them are after the second strawberry though. On the surface level, these multiple approaches are especially satisfying given we have to dodge the boss's well-telegraphed charge at a moment's notice and can vary our approach accordingly. However, going past surface level, they're actually necessary to avoid making this boss feel repetitive. We could be playing a level that sends us from one horizontal platform to the next, requiring us to jump when the boss charges, and that's it. With multiple approaches, we get different elevations to work with in the same vertical space. Instead of just simply jumping every time, we can change elevation. It's more about positioning, or a mix of positioning and timing, or even predicting when we should change our route, rather than just timing our jump. We can see a simpler version of this in a previous level, where these platforms have 2 elevations to them, again, to more emphasize positioning or a mix rather than just timing. All of this is rather subtle, but it makes a world of difference. Chapter 3's boss is very well handled. To conclude Chapter 3, Oshiro should change his name to Stop Ro, because there's no reason he should be chasing us. The lock and key implementation complements Celeste very well, and we see that firsthand in Chapter 3. The worm tendrils are misleading, but are otherwise a great addition to platforming. Critters are a fine idea, but the stripped down concept of a back and forth obstacle easily devolves into a system that relies on trial and error rather than skill. The B-side mostly has these issues that stem from these critters, but the chapter itself also has this issue here and there. The entire clutter section is well defined and thoroughly fleshed out, but the fact that cleaning up the clutter affects the other paths isn't telegraphed, and the blue heart wasn't executed very well. Chapter 3 demonstrates how lengthier levels can actually work incredibly well in Celeste, especially due to the game's use of safety, multiple approaches, strawberries, and never having to wait on slow-moving platforms or the like. This chapter was well designed as a whole, and I don't mean critters or level design by that, I mean structurally, regarding the world design, like how we saw the strawberry from the entrance that we found later on, and same with the B-side cassette tape. We see this throughout the entire chapter. Throughout Chapter 3's boss chase, we see night turn into morning. Chapter 4 occurs over the morning, meaning she didn't get any sleep. That's not very good for her health. Chapter 4 provides a resolution to the Oshiro business, and Madeline clearly conveys her determination to make it to the summit. This is important to establish because, well, there's a strong wind pushing against her. That's basically it in terms of story and environment. Onto the first room, and oh boy, I didn't realize I was going to hit my rant so soon into the chapter. Earlier I said that one of the 2 most misunderstood concepts in the game was the worms in Chapter 3. The other is clouds. First of all, clouds are about verticality, yes, but they require horizontal movement in this introductory room, so this room is not a great way to introduce the concept, especially since they don't work as expected. I just wanted to get that out of the way. Now, more importantly, how would you expect these clouds to work? You're probably thinking, obviously like a trampoline. In every platformer that establishes some kind of jumping system where there's a bouncy object of some sort, pressing the jump button during contact or on the nadir will extend the jump. Either that or a jump won't affect the height. Both of these options are clearly conveyed in these systems. They're well established between platformers, and even if you've never played a platformer before, it's a reasonable assumption to make based on the animation that resembles a trampoline. No matter the context, trampoline jumping is how the player will approach these clouds unless the game establishes otherwise. Celeste does not establish otherwise. So how do the clouds work? It's probably what you're yelling. Momentum, of course. I'm not joking, you actually have to ride the cloud's momentum. In no way, shape, or form would I ever assume we had to ride the momentum of an object that buoyantly bounces. It's like how I would never assume anything other than momentum for Chapter 1's gear platforms. I'm not going to try to bounce on them. I didn't know how the clouds actually worked until specifically this level in the Chapter 4 B-side. Sometimes I would make it over the thorns, sometimes I wouldn't. I was almost able to beat the level before I figured out what the problem was. I consider myself lucky that I ended up figuring out how the clouds actually worked. Chapter 3's worms weren't a big deal. They were simply horribly telegraphed to the player and marginally increased the difficulty by making the player rush. But even then, if the player was too slow, the depression wouldn't kill them. These clouds, however, were frustrating because I thought they were oddly precise, so I would fall or die by no fault of my own, especially since pink clouds disappear. The next room introduces the second main mechanic of this chapter, blue bubbles. However, when dashing into it for the first time, 2 of the directions lead to death, 1 leads to ground, and 1 leads up to safety. It's not a safe environment and does not convey what we need to know regarding the blue bubbles. First of all, the blue bubbles push you out if you don't provide a direction, so that's potential death. That's no good. Second of all, we need to force a dash here so that we can convey that these bubbles recover our dash. We already have to dash to enter the bubble, but not on the way out. We can easily fix that by lifting the platform up so that we have to dash to make it to the platform, or at least to reach the walls. After passing the old lady, we encounter wind. Wind completely changes how we approach levels relative to movement and even dashing. The platforming we've done in the game up till this point has been steadily progressing, with the platforms getting smaller and a stronger emphasis on interacting with the sides of these platforms. Now, instead of progressing these platforms into something ridiculous, there's a twist applied in the form of wind. We then encounter a rather strange blue bubble room for only being the second bubble room thus far, moving from 2 non-consecutive bubbles to a series of 7 consecutive bubbles. Whoa, man! What's more is that these bubbles are combined with breakable walls that have never been used in this kind of context before. The end goal, however, is to dash from bubble to bubble. If we think about this progression like that, moving what should have been a dash into safety bubble in room 2 to a dash into another bubble, then this sudden ramp up actually makes sense, but I could be pulling a strawberry out of my bum on that one. No matter how uncomfortable that is. The strawberry in this room shows us how fast the bubbles respawn, which is very nice information for the player to have. It's not necessary information, which is why it's attached to a strawberry and not a doorbell, for instance, but conveying the ins and outs of mechanics, whether optional or not, is very attractive. That's why I'm single. The next 2 rooms offer more wind, one with flat platforms, one with more vertical platforms, a bubble combined with doorbells? I mean, sure, why not? All of this leads to this hunk of a room. We're combining clouds with wind now that both have been established separately, ending with a bubble even. It's the triad of chapter 4. And even more, we can use the wind to traverse across to the secret. This is when everything is ramping up, for better or for worse. After the bubble, the wind changes up and alternates between strong wind and no wind, and is another great example of how the heck am I supposed to grab that strawberry? The answer is utilizing the wind to your benefit rather than the wind acting as a crutch. See, Madeline's journey is even leaking to the player. Hey, it's our good old buddy the seeds. They're essentially the doorbells of flying strawberries, and the idea of never touching the ground is a satisfying challenge. The problem here is that there's no reason we wouldn't assume the springboard counts as touching the ground. But it does not actually count as touching the ground and is necessary for completing this challenge. So we figured that out via trial and error. Alright, so this next area is essentially a chamber of secrets that comprises 5 optional areas, each progressing a new system, these moving and sometimes adjustable blocks. First of all, this room off to the right is wonderfully set up. We can learn the basics of these new blocks by just standing on them and jumping over the obstacles. The arrow is a clear indicator of what may happen, and enough time is given to realize or confirm the effect before encountering an obstacle. However, if you notice, these blocks have pressure plates on them that allow us to move the block ourselves perpendicular to the arrow, meaning if you figure this mechanic out, then you can just fly over the obstacles. That is one way to make discovery fun. Back to the central hub, the room we just came from is blocked off, so that's a nice indicator that we've collected everything in that room. We can only reach the higher rooms via this block. the room directly above is most likely to be our second room, then we can just keep climbing higher and higher with this single block. All of these rooms are just different applications for the blocks. There's no wind and virtually no bubbles, since bubbles are used separately once. Right after the bubbles, however, is a great example of a space that could have been a tense fall if we ran out of stamina before, similar to the wasted potential of Chapter 3's equivalent. Before we continue past the central hub of blocks, we find a secret within the water, a blue heart. You know, I understand Matt's love for Mario 3, but I have to be blunt here. This is an awful secret, it's awful design, because it requires outside knowledge. Most people will have to look this up because even people like me who have played Mario 3 don't know about the white block, so ducking for a few seconds to recreate what happens in Mario 3 is terrible. There's no reason to expect the player to know what to do here. This should have been an Easter egg, not a requirement for unlocking Chapter 8 and the Chapter 8 B-side. And just to clarify, that is my main gripe with it. This wouldn't be a big deal if it was just a simple Easter egg and not an actual requirement for unlocking content. I will say, the idea of using the background was the only positive side to this, and I wish that was incorporated into the chapter in some way. The next 3 rooms proceed with the blocks. Remember, the previous area was 95% optional, so the central hub taught us how these blocks work and that they take user input perpendicular to the arrow. The next room uses a block to reach higher ground, this time utilizing vertical movement instead of horizontal. Next, we have to jump from block to block as they move right. And finally, with the cloud mixed in, we have the previous 2 rooms combined, with the block moving right, user input control and verticality, moving to grab the side, and jumping from block to block, although optional in this room. Everything was part of the previous 2 rooms. Alright, we're back in some windy territory, and so now would be a great time to break down the wind's strengths and weaknesses. The wind is at its best when the distance needed is clear and when it feels like you're overcoming the wind's strong presence. Both of these aspects work together, such as this windy level. It's clear that a horizontal dash is what you need for that oomph. So we oomph a couple times and find ourselves a spot of safety, which is another element that really complements the wind. Punctuating stretches of stress with the more relieving nature of safety, providing that ebb and flow so that the stretches of intense wind feel more impactful. From the spot of safety, we jump and dash toward the bubble, and it gives that leap of faith feeling. Then we move into another type of safety before jumping back into the wind. Never once did I question if the game wanted a horizontal, vertical, or diagonal dash out of me. This room is the epitome of the wind's strengths. Now, what we don't want is a trial and error situation where we're trying to figure out what kind of dash is expected, which is especially important since this chapter loves to change the wind speed, meaning we can never get used to the wind. Of course, this is by design, and that's fine. It means that we always have to be on our toes. But then the design needs to support this, and when it doesn't, that's when the wind is at its weakest. Take the very next room, for instance. Everything about this room is fine, except when jumping from the left side of this wall to the right. It's difficult to judge without just dying from testing it. One aspect from the previous room that worked so well was how the leap of faith gave us enough time to brace the wind. Here, when jumping over these spikes, there's no time to brace the wind, so it's trial and error. The next room demonstrates this idea well. The cloud is placed where we know to horizontally dash, then we adjust accordingly during the jump to land on top. We're given time to brace the wind. Same with our descent into our dash. There's enough of a fall to give us time to brace the wind and then let the wind carry us home. The next room is yet another great example. We're given time to adjust to this ever-changing external force. We're given time to brace the wind so it doesn't devolve into trial and error, trying to figure out the different timings that the wind forces us into. Toward the end, however, this is where we have a potential trial and error platform that completely depends on when the player dashes. If we dash up high, we have enough time to brace the wind. If we dash down low, we'll have to die to learn that diagonal dashing is much more reliable. Bracing the wind has to happen at some point, so this demonstrates how user input can affect this. Alright, so wind aside, the next room is one of the strongest in this chapter. Jumping from platform to platform, climbing, and reacting. This is the only room like this in the entire chapter, unfortunately, which is kinda strange when you think about it. The strawberry in the room above is a great example of players overthinking. Some strawberries require a bit of thinking and planning, figuring out how to approach a strawberry, and in this case, it's really just as simple as switching walls, hitting the doorbell, and dashing at any point before the door hits the end. I didn't realize it was built like that my first time around. I think that's pretty clever. We then come across a block that we have to ride whilst moving objects out of the way, and it's a great test of speed and efficiency. This is another strong usage of these blocks, and besides the optional room back in the block area, is never used again. And now let's zoom out on the map. Look familiar? A fork in the road that ends with no backtracking, but this time each path has a strawberry. This isn't something one would expect, and so of course we won't know to backtrack before reaching the top until we've reached the top. When we're cut off. And that's when we realize we've missed something and it's too late. Not to mention, you wouldn't expect there to be a strawberry on each path. You don't expect the game to expect you to backtrack there, to both paths, before proceeding. That just doesn't make sense. This isn't a secret. It's arbitrarily adding exploration or an alternative path where it doesn't fit. Keep in mind, exploration was done incredibly well before in this chapter with the block area. Alright, so we move on to a tense struggle against the wind with the floor crumbling underneath our feet. The strawberry, however, is trial and error in this tight space that gives no time to brace the wind. On a bright note, the doorbell room demonstrates brace the wind very well. For the last set of levels, we're attacked by yet another new obstacle, snowballs. Just like the Oshiro boss chase, the use of multiple approaches and elevations is very well done and complements the snowballs. These last levels are lengthier and follow the 3 tactics: no waiting on platforms for instance, multiple approaches, and strawberries in the middle to offer permanent progress. Snowballs mean that not even these points of safety are safe, so the multiple approaches help with the new twist. Springboards act similarly to clouds, yet are placed like a previous rock platform level, so it's a perfect mix-up. The wind picks up as we struggle to our no longer points of safety, putting more pressure on us. It moves to bubbles, then a mix of wind, bubbles, and clouds. The wind is so strong at this point that we can barely move right, and so this wall is a nice buffer to help with bracing the wind. Finally, our release. We push past the wind barrier and propel ourselves across the last level in this chapter. There's a clear story being told here, and it's told well. Chapter 4 introduced a new coinage that every game designer will use from now on. Brace the wind, which essentially says that the player needs time to adjust when facing fluctuating external forces, trademark and patent pending. We all need time to brace the wind, lest we fall into trial and error. Chapter 4 also brings to light how each chapter introduces so many new ideas in such a short time span. I introed the video saying that, but what does that mean? Well, it's subtler in Chapter 2, how the dream blocks and the seeds were a pretty great combination, but only used once. Chapter 3 was much longer than Chapter 2 and was able to flesh out the depression, critters, worms, and sinking platforms, to the point where the universal objects, such as the rock platforms and doorbells, were used to complement the main systems. Chapter 4 contained special blocks, white and pink clouds, blue bubbles, wind, and snowballs. The universal objects like springboards and rock platforms can be used to great effect with the wind, and so they become more integral with the main systems, although springboards and clouds are almost forgotten about, while the bubbles were abundantly used. Chapter 4 overall completely changed how we approached movement and dashing. It simulated a struggle and gave safety new meaning. There was a story to tell in this chapter that ramped up toward the end with stronger winds and snowballs, but because of that, some ideas introduced in this chapter were never fully fleshed out. Sure, introducing so many new ideas in such a short span can keep the chapter fresh, but that can also leave some of these concepts in the dust. And this is not a desert level, let me tell you that. But hey, you know what they say, brace the wind. If Chapter 2 was a brief surface-level exploration of Madeline's mind, Chapter 5 is diving into the deep end. If Chapter 4 was the mountain presenting an external struggle, Chapter 5 is the mountain presenting an internal struggle. Chapter 5 utilizes the lock and key system to great effect, with its focus more on exploration. That's not all this chapter explores, however. Fear, the unknown, lighting our way, becoming lost in a maze, facing our demons, and what better way to convey these aspects or emotions than by placing us in large, sometimes relatively pitch black areas. So let's begin with the let's split up gang trope, and the closest thing to a horror chapter we have in this game. First, of course, Theo runs off, as per the ridiculous trope I can only assume is used here as satire. Then we dash through a hole that teaches us something we only use once more in the entire game, and we find Theo's phone in front of a mirror. Well, normally we would be like, ooh, spooky, and not really care, but we find it next to a mirror, meaning we know that he got sucked in somewhere, considering Darky has been popping out of mirrors, so that raises our interest at the very least. Anyway, we have a new type of platform right off the bat, the dash platforms. They're introduced in a room full of them, with no easy way to the exit otherwise. Nice. The exit is blocked off as to encourage finding the Theo mirror. The exit being blocked isn't necessary, but it's a thoughtful precautionary measure. Although, let's catch up with how the game establishes its exit lights. Chapter 1 used them for side paths or secrets. Chapter 2 used them to convey the main paths. Chapter 3 back to side paths, and now Chapter 5 back to main paths. It's to the point where the light has no meaning, but at least it's consistent as in the chapters regarding Madeline's mind. Chapters 2 and 3 regard her mind, and the light is used for a main path. I disagree with its usage, but I understand the intent. Unless the lights are only meant to highlight certain entrances disregarding context, only Matt knows, but that intent isn't any better. Then a red bubble. It'll automatically go off to the right without user input, so it's safe and a nice demonstration of both the bubbles and these green buttons that the bubble slams us into. It's simple and very well done. It's a 2-in-1 special, so we can get right into the open areas, the meat of this chapter. The first section is lit up and wide open. The exit on the other side switches the music and is pitch dark as to set expectations beforehand, but more importantly, these locked doors allow us to make sure we explore everything before proceeding, and that's absolutely key for platformers since, well, I don't know about you, but I hate missing out on content by no fault of my own. I find myself constantly wondering in platformers which path leads to the next area and which leads to a dead end or side path that I need to explore before proceeding. I'm very happy to say that I never once had this thought cross my mind in this chapter. So first, let's talk about the area below. Dash platforms that act as doors, 2 simple dash platform rooms, 1 on each side, and a bubble room in between that establishes dashing out of bubbles. A strawberry that requires us to remember about momentum, something we haven't done for a while now. 2 paths below that utilize dash platforms, one of which requires the bubble, and both unlock a shortcut back, which is always satisfying in an exploration-based open area. To the left we have a dash platform room, to the right a bubble room, both have us thinking outside the box. The right room has forced momentum as a reminder for the secret in the previous room, which is #good design. In the main room we can mess around with the bubbles. The bubble near a strawberry leads through a platform and into this section's upper area. Riding a bubble from below to this room may hint at what to do here, and that would be riding a bubble from another room into this one, then continue till the key, or if you're observant, into this suspicious looking ceiling. Instead of a strawberry we have a button? What? Oh, now we're talking. The hidden path that the button opens is reasonable to find too, since despite the secret not being obvious, we know it exists, so we're searching for it and find it using the red bubble. The secret leads to a room where we dash out of red bubbles and cling onto walls to hit the doorbells, and it's a satisfying end to such a wonderful surprise of a secret. These ideas presented thus far are absolutely ingenious for this chapter's open exploratory areas. The shortcuts, the buttons that open secrets, the bubbles that travel from one room to another, all great design features that really complement this entire section. We'll come back to this. So we proceed into the Dark Abyss section where we're immediately introduced to darkness with yellow lights accentuating a mirror. Oh! Hey, it's Theo! This only confirms that there's another side to the mirror, so now we're intrigued. But besides that, he doesn't matter for our purposes. This very first dark room, however, establishes that exploring the abyss itself will be necessary, since it hides a secret in the dark. So let's dive into our abyss, shall we? Slowly crawling through the dark while lighting our way, exploring the entire area and slipping into secrets and bonus areas. Reaching the top and seeing this creature thing, and you might not even pay much mind to the lighting used here. The yellow lighting, as seen next to Theo's mirror and every danger in this area, except twice. So what do these lights mean? Well, Daryl Talks Games discusses this in his video, how Celeste's mirror temple creates fear. Link will be at the end of this video and in the description for your convenience. The title of his video says it all, fear. The yellow lighting around the mysterious mirror, this elder creature illuminating the red thorns, highlighting rock platforms, highlighting a wall. It's not exactly consistent. So firstly, finding a rock platform in complete darkness would be a novel idea. We can assume this leads the way out, but either way, this yellow light is completely unnecessary and a blue light would have worked better here. Also keep in mind there's a perpetual light surrounding Madeline. Secondly, this wall of yellow lights does not convey fear or even danger for that matter. Unless walls are dangerous. One could argue that it's necessary so the player knows what the end goal is and thus can use momentum because it's pitch black otherwise, but that's the entire point of this section or area. It's to be cautious and fear in the unknown. If we're only given a single dash platform, our best bet is to gain the most distance possible. So we're going to try momentum, which has been established in this chapter plenty before. This is actually done later on to great effect even. If they wanted to drive home the elder monster, imminent danger, magic mirror, fear association with a yellow light, it would have been more beneficial to cut out the fluff and pay mind to its placements. If that's what Matt was going for. I'm not Matt, I'm Corvus, I'm a different person. This section also furthers the platforms and bubbles. The platforms has us really taken their positioning into consideration. The first platform is inaccessible at its origin, the second only accessible at its origin, and the third acts as an obstacle. The red bubbles were first introduced as an environmental mechanic, then for the individual rooms or levels, the bubbles stressed dashing to cancel out of a bubble, which is great. It's satisfying, and the game knows this, so the chapter really hits that idea with a hammer. What really jiggles me, however, is this strawberry. It's surrounded by doors on both sides, something we've opened with switches before and for the rest of the chapter. Guess how we obtain this strawberry? Is it by finding a hidden button in some dark corner like we would expect from seeing the doors? No, just climb underneath. This is not only misleading design, but it's such a wasted opportunity. The abyss continues thematically in the next area. These creature statues are showcased more often. There are broken mirrors. A great one watches over the area. It's a wonderfully dark and creepy area. Oh, and red bubbles are now back in the environment. The yellow lights are mainly used in hazardous strawberry and key rooms yet again, keeping that tension in the challenge rooms while alleviating it in the more exploration-focused dark areas. It's essentially Chapter 5's version of Chapter 4's safety that provided that ebb and flow. The challenge rooms still hold true to generosity and multiple approaches, and as we head toward the key, we come across pitch black rooms. I can say with absolute confidence that these type of rooms are some of the best rooms in the entirety of the game, and they're rare. They're ingeniously designed so that we never have to unreasonably guess, or we see a little hint of something, such as this wall. The red thorns are faintly highlighted no matter how dark, and the non-wall background offers some faint light as well. So these pitch black rooms are actually pretty generous, and subtly so. These type of rooms really hit home how we have to be careful, that danger is lurking in the dark, and they're overall more tense and effective than the lit up rooms in this chapter. The next room does the same thing with occasional yellow lights to show hazards ahead of time, although they kind of diminish some of the effect. The point of the darkness and the blue lights is to inch your way along, to be cautious and careful. This yellow light showing the blade makes it so we don't have to climb up carefully to see the hazard ahead of time. It completely defeats the point. So now we can head below the scary monster and find ourselves more dark areas with yellow lights as well? This doesn't make any sense. Surely the B-side location doesn't need any more hints than a door, and at the expense of diminishing the yellow lights and the exploration involved in finding the button that opens this door. Besides that though, the buttons are being used to encourage exploring the entirety of a room or area, and I like that. That's good. The next room does the same thing, but furthers this by having a secret in the corner that leads to a strawberry, which is well hidden in the dark. Secrets like this that take advantage of the darkness are definitely my favorite. If you've noticed though, we're now in quite a bit of light. So if we fall back down and through the door, we come across some seeds yet again. However, there's no twist here. Chapter 2's dream blocks allowed us to fly around in this fun hodgepodge of forgotten dreams. Chapter 4's wind set up interesting objectives, similar to doorbells, except we can't touch the floor, although springboards don't count, I guess. The point is, the first two uses were fine, especially since dream blocks and seeds were meant for each other. But there's nothing that sets seeds apart in Chapter 5 unless red bubbles were taken advantage of, but they weren't. At the very least, this room should have had seeds with no floor and no light, since that would follow the Dark Abyss theme. And currently, this room is jarring and breaks the atmosphere because all of a sudden there's light seeping into everything. What happened to the atmosphere? So now that we have the key, let us zoom across a chasm where we can unlock the door. But wait a second, I wonder if there might just be a secret somewhere given this very strangely placed chasm, like this tiny hole underneath this platform. What? That's a red bubble! And it leads us past the room, but wait, we still have the key. Now this is getting crazy. Since we're about to hit a complete 180 transition in this chapter, we have a lengthy room of bubble-to-bubble platforming. There's no waiting, there's surprisingly multiple approaches that make our travels slightly quicker. And no strawberries? Now that's preposterous. Except we never stand on anything during this entire level, so having a strawberry here would be pointless. We wouldn't be able to bank it. The next spooky area has a dirty secret where we use the key from earlier. This secret is fantastic, except if the player thinks that a key is hidden somewhere in the above area, and I wouldn't blame them, it's entirely possible. But hey, besides that, it's a very clever secret that leads to the Blue Heart Room. This is the best room in the entire chapter. There's complete darkness, never a moment where I can't reasonably judge what to do, taking it one cautious step at a time. Oh, I wish there were more rooms like this, but hey, these chapters have a story to tell, and so now it's time to face the dreaded mirror that warps us and reverses the music. Oh boy, we actually get to control the now animated monsters. This is a clever way of making sure we understand how this creature works, although at the cost of how we initially perceive the monster since we're already familiar with its moveset, capabilities, and limitations. This lends itself well to accessibility though, due to the aforementioned familiarity, so I can see how this approach would be higher on the pros than the cons for what Celeste is trying to achieve. Right away, we can figure out that the monster can dash, can break red blocks, and cannot pass white particles. As a nice bonus, the monster's dash also uses the same button as Madeline's dash, so we can make that connection, and thus the controls will be instinctive for players. Madeline tries to run away, gets killed, and probably traumatized, and wakes up in a nightmarish hellscape with blaring synths. If you listen closely, however, you might hear some whispering. Very subtle, but sets the mood brilliantly. We talk to Darky for some character stuff, then we move into our first mix of dash platforms and red bubbles. Really, throughout the rest of the chapter up until Theo, Matt keeps on running with these two objects, and I'll leave it be from now on because, man, there's only so much I can praise about these mechanics before I start beating a dead horse. So we continue onward, minding our own business. Oh crap, what? Now that was kinda scary. This is a great introduction to these creatures as AI, but I do want to note how the next several rooms and areas for that matter really hit on these creatures, and that's fine. It's a straight up horror chase, essentially, but just an idea. Imagine if these statues were spread about. Some rooms no creatures break out, some would. Now, I think that would create more tension, although the next several rooms definitely have that oh crap feel, and this idea would need worked out into an exploration focused area, but it's just something to think about, since the current tension can easily wear thin by this overexposure. Which brings up a great point. Celeste and Luigi's Mansion crossover? Yes! Now, I'm sure you've noticed by now from the footage that every room except 2 use doorbells, which is the perfect system thus far to really force a player to stick around when they don't want to, hence why they were first introduced in Chapter 2 during the chase sequence. These red blocks provide temporary cover unless the monster breaks it, and that's just dangerous. But of course, grumpy old Corvus here has a complaint, and that would be the first red block room that establishes, or shall I say, sets a precedent that these red blocks can contain strawberries. There's only one red block strawberry in the entire chapter. Yes, the red block is glowing and pulsing, so it's fair in terms of we're not going to check every red block afterward since the glowy block is so prominent, unless the player doesn't notice it's glowing before the monster breaks it because our focus is on the monster, the actual threat. That's a dangerous potentiality that could result in the player breaking every single block throughout this entire section for no reason. That actually kinda happened to me. But disregarding that potentiality, this room also happens to double as a red block introduction, not including the monsters segment. It'd be better if the game established the red block function first, then introduced the secret later on, especially since it's so prominent and would be more of a nice surprise instead of, oh, I guess we're setting this precedent. It's not a satisfying or rewarding find, it just kinda happens, since the red blocks haven't been fully established yet. This loosely ties itself with a cognitive bias known as functional fixedness. Daryl Talks Games has a video about it, link will be in the description and at the end of this video for your convenience. I probably watched this video at the time of writing this, so that's why I'm mentioning it here. I think it's pretty cool, and game designers definitely need to be aware of it. The music shifts to a much more atmospheric track, but with drums as a reminder of where we are, to keep us grounded, per se. This also smoothly transitions when we travel up to find Theo. The whispering and breathing still occurs, and really, I can't stress that wonderful subtlety enough. This final open area is a perfect finish to the more exploration-focused aspects of this chapter. It's dark in a labyrinth of an area with a single creature lurking in the middle. There are 2 locked doors blocking our path with this red bubble, so we have to grab the 2 keys we can see near the exit by exploring the dark labyrinth. And then a bonus key if we use the creature to break our way into an entire area. One of the paths explores the creatures further by ending with us taking advantage of its movement so it hits a doorbell, then we jump off of it to hit the second doorbell. Maybe it's just me, but enemy environment interaction, and enemy friendly fire for that matter, is one of my favorite additions to games. Whew, I just love it. We unlock the 2 doors and proceed past with an optional 3rd key for a strawberry. Theo's fears are mixed with ours, as the eyes surrounding us are from him, the common fear instigated by social media of being watched and judged. Whenever we enter a room with a monster, the drums are added back in for some tension. You might notice the whispering is still here. Celeste is the first game to implement ASMR. The next few levels focus on both Madeline and Theo working both separately and as a team. Madeline has to hit the button on her own. Either works here and you can tell the button is in a position to suggest using Theo. This one suggests throwing Theo and then taking the high route to hit the button. Here we might end up learning that throwing Theo, then taking the high route is the most efficient. Both people are involved in hitting the doorbells. Then finally, we find that the most efficient way to complete this room is to travel together. Although it does support multiple approaches. We can stomp on him twice, then propel ourselves. We can press the button and leave, but realize that the game hates us and so makes the last jump deceiving. There's then a temporary non-drum room to show how Theo can safely travel through red thorns. These thorns and dash platforms are used in the next several rooms. This was ingeniously designed to incorporate multiple approaches, where we don't need to pass him through thorns most of the time, but doing so can make our lives easier. Finally, a distorted finale. Fun fact, this last stretch utilizes 5 different tracks. I can't tell you exactly how they're used since they're distorted and I don't have access to the code, but it's pretty cool. Chapter 5 has to be my favorite chapter. The systems are not only fleshed out, but they work well with the environment. red bubbles traveling from one room to another, and buttons opening shortcuts, secret doors, although that only happens once, and side paths, so it forces us to explore the room, although that only happens twice. The darkness wasn't complete darkness because of the light from the non-wall background, but the pitch blackness was there and was extremely effective with the blue lights. The yellow lights conveyed fear or danger, yet were sometimes spread around all willy-nilly. The atmosphere, environment, and the story and character narrative was extremely well done. It's a great setup for Chapter 6's heavy character narrative focus. The exploration becomes progressively more chaotic, ending with a labyrinth of an area. These elder creatures utilized doorbells very well and ended up mixed in with dash platforms and red bubbles. The faint breathing and whispering reversed with the music was the subtlest of best touches to this chapter's mirror madness. When we reverse the static voice file, we get a monologue that I played at several points during this video. I do wish darkness was taken advantage of slightly more, like with the creatures or just more rooms like the Blue Heart room, but hey, each chapter has a story to tell, and Chapter 5 tells its story well. So I completely forgot to make note of this. What the heck is up with this dead end? I mean, there's blue lights leading to it and everything. It doesn't make any sense. This legitimately baffled me. After what Madeline and Theo just went through, how can they not sit by the fire and talk for a good while? It's nice character development and, well, let's be honest here, it's a nice break from the scarring trip through Madeline's psyche. Before long, however, we're fast asleep and back into a dream world, where we learn the brand new mechanic of flying. Free to soar and enjoy the beauty of our dream. Oh, no, stop! I thought this was a dream! After feather flying up into the sky, we witness a beautiful backdrop while Darky comes out and they have a talk. Darky's character is fascinating. She's portrayed as evil when we're first introduced to her in Chapter 2, and that's not necessarily wrong. Darky is meant to be Madeline's negative emotions personified, or essentially her depression and anxiety. So what does Madeline do? Well, at first she's scared, then tries to understand why Darky is following her, but it's always focused on the fact that Madeline doesn't want her there. She just wants to push Darky aside and not have to deal with her, rather than face the problem and take an optimistic approach. The fact that Madeline is scared is what causes her to act this way, to push Darky aside, saying, "I don't need you," without actually dealing with her in a healthy manner. Madeline will still have these emotions, depression, and anxiety that need dealt with inside her, but her instinct is to temporarily rid of them because she's, well, like I said, she's scared. People react instinctively out of fear, and Madeline does exactly that right after a chapter based around fear. What's more is that Darky is also scared. Since both of them are scared, they're both vulnerable, and thus they both lash out at each other. Darky first, not so subtly representing depression, pulling Madeline down to the bottom, then Madeline in self-defense. After all's said and done, however, they're able to actually start building a relationship and talk out their differences. Now, instead of being scared, they can be confident together. They can start communicating without automatically being defensive because they now trust one another. Darky is now revealing her fear of failure so Madeline can talk it out, maintain the trust, and deal with the problem. We see Theo and Grandma Chio help build her up and help her find her way. This cannot be understated. The people in your life are crucial to your development. A good way to tell this is if you talk to your friend about your good news or good fortune. If they celebrate, they're true friends and beneficial to be around. If they don't, or bring up someone else's bad news or whatever, they are detrimental to your well-being. Theo is climbing with Madeline, yet he's genuinely interested in Madeline's journey in life. He empathizes and asks questions. Madeline thinks Grandma Chio is a crazy, mean old bat. Grandma is there to warn people who arrive and helps them leave through shortcuts, which pretty much everyone does. In Chapter 6, we see that Grandma genuinely wants to see Madeline deal with the problems that the mountain has personified. Both Theo and Chio, and even Oshiro, end up celebrating with Madeline at the end of the game for her monumental accomplishment. See, they're good friends. A significant change in this chapter compared to the others is the fact that there are no strawberries. There are sections in Chapter 5 that are noticeably very light in strawberries. Both the monster sections only have 1 strawberry each, so even though the strawberry count is roughly the same as previous chapters, it felt noticeably lessened because of 2 of the segments after the mirror transition. After escaping from that fear-ridden hole and the constant battering of Chapter 4, I was hoping for a break of sorts with no strawberries. That's exactly what I got. The pacing is absolutely brilliant. Pacing aside, we just fell from our climb. We're down, sad, depressed. We don't know how to deal with ourselves and our other self. Strawberries would make no sense in this context, and it's wonderful that Matt focused on this crucial moment to flesh out Madeline and Darky's character. Chapter 6 gives us time to reflect. That's why the place resembles an ethereal grove with reflecting objects like water and crystals. That's why we land in water and reflect upon what happened in a small confined pond. That's why this chapter is called Reflection. Now, without strawberries, you might be worried that this chapter suffers in regards to replayability. Strawberries offer heavy replayability because they're more challenging, some are hidden, and they're overall more rewarding as you replay and master a chapter. Chapter 6 is still rewarding to come back and master, but it lacks the content that strawberries offer in the previous chapters. Chapter 6 makes up for this with split paths. Split paths are present in most of the pre-boss levels, and I know you might be thinking this is hypocritical of someone who hated split paths before now, but here, there's an expected replayability that's consistent and ingrained. Chapters 1 and 4 had us replaying the chapter for one split path, which simply wasn't worth replaying the chapter for. That's what the strawberries were for, and split paths essentially replaced the strawberries in Chapter 6. Although I'm not sure why the bottom path punishes you for taking it compared to the top, but that only happens once, so not a big deal, I just need to mention it for some reason. So after the fall, we're immediately introduced to blockheads. Hit an edge, they move in that direction, simple enough. What's rather perplexing, however, is how the thorns were able to reform so quickly after crashing through them. What's neat though is how we can notice these thorns and think, let's use the block to break them, and that results in nothing. Such a wasted opportunity, especially since past the next room you can see the thorns and it looks like a potential shortcut of some sort. Disappointment aside, let's pop into the open area. To the right is where Madeline reflects, and to the left is where we break a wall so we can feather our way to a ledge. The second feather sends us higher, and then the third feather sends us beneath thorns and to an entrance. Goodness, there are several things I want to talk about in this area alone. First off, the blue heart. Plain and simple, the concept is lazy. Remember that pattern for Chapter 1's blue heart? Probably not, because I didn't talk about it, but there's a pattern to learn for that blue heart, as demonstrated by the computer for the order and the birds for the dash angle. That's a fair puzzle, and thus a good blue heart. Now, take that exact same pattern and do it again. I'm not kidding, the game is expecting you to replay Chapter 1, write down the pattern so we can replicate it, and then do it again with left and right reversed, then do it again with up and down reversed, and finally do it again with all directions inversed. That's just tedious and a blatant waste of our time. We, as players, assume each chapter is self-contained in that we don't need anything from previous chapters. That is what's established in Celeste. So now we have to somehow figure out that we need to know the pattern from chapter 1, and if you do realize that these colored crystals are referring to chapter 1, then there's still the problem of having to go back and write down the darn pattern. That's not problem solving, that's memorization and guesswork. Let's now continue to these purple thorns we saw when flying to the blue heart. The blockhead earlier, unfortunately, couldn't break through the purple thorns, yet seeing this instantly made me think of the potential here. Imagine using the block to fly up, to the right, then up. That would have been a really clever secret within a secret, and it wouldn't have been too tight because we can trigger the block on the way back when it's moving slowly. We break the thorns with the block, and then we can use the feather here to fly into it. That would truly take advantage of this open space beyond the feathers. In fact, that would have been a significantly better idea for a blue heart. Reasonable, satisfying, and takes advantage of space. Speaking of feathers, feathers are used very well in the beginning of this chapter in this wide open, ethereal dreamscape of a break after chapter 5. We're also introduced to bubble feathers that require a dash to obtain. The feathers are also used extremely well in this area where we use them to climb to different ledges. Later on, they're used in an open area that requires dashing from certain angles. However, that concept isn't expanded upon, and the feathers are at their weakest when used to navigate relatively tight spaces, which is fairly often. In those scenarios, the feather kinda works depending on your control preference. If you're playing with a D-pad, and I use a D-pad for almost every single game I play, then you're screwed because it's stuck as 8 directional input, which makes it much harder to navigate between thorns. The analog stick works fine though, so if that's what you're using to play this game, you shouldn't have any issues, but D-pads are a common way to play platformers, and the feather punishes that. If we continue past this feathered traveling area, we'll see some nice blockage. Taking positioning into account, then re-hitting the block once it breaks another block. Next room, we ride a block past hazards and then, whoops! You may be wondering how I wound up in this situation. How was I supposed to know that was gonna happen? The timing on momentum isn't meant to be used in a sudden reaction type of scenario. Moving on, this is when the split paths start and when the concepts intertwine. That's typical though. Let's discuss something a bit more mixed in terms of reception. The bumpers. The bumpers, I feel, are possibly the most controversial system, at least from the friends I've talked to. One argument is that the bumpers are wonky, and I'm here to disprove that. To do that, I can slow down the footage and check how accurate the bounce angles are. This one looks like she'll bounce at this angle. And she does. The bumpers are not wonky. However, the bumpers could feel wonky if they aren't accommodated correctly, and by that I mean, imagine if we placed a bumper in this chapter 5 room. Sure, the angle isn't wonky, but by goodness that would feel like trial and error wonkiness because it's not given enough room for it to breathe. Chapter 6 utilizes these bumpers perfectly, and may actually be my favorite mechanic or system in the entire game. Don't take my word on that though, I may be crazy. The bumpers work because there's plenty of wiggle room. Take this basic bumper level right after our safe introduction. If we bounce at the wrong angle, there's plenty of room to adjust or even dash, because the bumpers refill our dash and stamina. Further ahead, we use block momentum to send us to a bumper. Later, we bounce around hidden doorbells, easily adjusting ourselves, including utilizing our dash. The very next room That was an accident. The top and bottom paths here are great examples of the feather solely being used to navigate between thorns. Dying here will be more a result of trial and error due to D-pad controls, and it's also just a weak use of the feather. I'm sorry, I find these feathered thorn rooms kinda boring. If we continue, we find the bumpers used in harsher conditions, having to grab through thorns, then hit the correct angle so we can preserve our dash for the wall grab. Even with the harsher angle, there's plenty of space and the wall is nice leverage. If thorns were on this wall, I would say it would be too tight because you could easily hit those thorns when trying to nail the harsher angle. However, this isn't always how these harsher or steeper angles are handled. On the bottom path, we find a room that has a clear steep angle, and there isn't as much room compared to what we just witnessed. Why does this work then, you may be asking? Well, it's actually rather simple. The game leads us to the exact spot we need in order to fly at the correct angle. Soon after, we find the exact same mentality, but utilized to greater effect, one after another, where we never have to worry if we're in the correct position or not. Like how there's a wall to stop the third bumper from sending you too far. They might have been able to get away with moving the fourth bumper over so we don't need this wall nor this feather, but in either case, this is one of the best rooms in the entire game. Alright, so here's another great bumper application. We have to navigate between bumpers, but if we fail, we can still utilize the bumpers and make it, thanks to the walls not being covered by thorns above. This is offering another way to complete the room as a failsafe. It's more difficult, but still possible, and makes for a far more interesting level than if it were just a glorified Chapter 3 back and forth critter level. In fact, you could even argue this level would be better without the feathers, since that's the simple and boring way to complete it. So now that we've discussed the side paths, blue heart, blocks, feathers, and bumpers, let's skip past Grandma Chio and hit one of my favorite segments, Darky's boss fight. The boss fight is intense, lengthy, and results in the exhaustion not only seen at the end, but felt by the player. Darky acts like a bumper too, so I'm happy. At first, Darky knocks us back and we make our way forward from there. As we continue, we learn how to adjust ourselves to our benefit after being knocked away, such as dashing forward to maximize distance and minimize time in front of danger. This segment begins with us being knocked back to a block, later we're knocked back to a wall, sometimes we're forced to react, and so on. The blocks fall after every hit, and eventually, Darky starts moving them on her own accord. There are 3 individual attacks that Darky can throw our way. One is a simple energy ball, one is a laser that charges up, and one is pairs of energy balls shot in quick succession. All 3 have great telegraphs, except, oddly enough, the telegraph disappears when this simple energy ball is used after the laser. This can catch us off guard. It's frustrating. The telegraph should have been kept. Finally, we can talk to our other self and start working as a team. We obtain a second dash because Celeste is basically Super Metroid. Chapter 6 is an ethereal grove that gives us time to reflect after the emotional fear-ridden playground Chapter 5 was. The atmosphere fit well, and the lack of strawberries was perfect because strawberries are happy and Madeline wasn't very happy. She also didn't want to expend the energy. That's what depression can do, and it reflects through the gameplay itself. Instead of strawberries and secrets adding replayability, we have split paths. The blockheads are another interesting block concept. They can break chunks of blue rock, but that's the extent of their environmental interaction, and it doesn't really go anywhere, like breaking purple thorns for instance. These blocks were the weakest regarding momentum out of any other block in the game. The last block is a large one with occasional obstacles to jump over. It's rather awkward due to the unpredictable nature of either jumping farther than you want to or not enough. The feathers are perfect for open areas like the Dreamscape, the Open Grove area, and the Bubble Thorn area. However, they're at their weakest when used to navigate purple thorns, especially with D-pad controls, and this is abused in the level design. The bumpers are magnificent. They knew that bumpers could be perceived as wonky and so designed around that, and to great effect. There are never any moments of trial and error trying to hit a certain angle but being slightly off and dying. In fact, the bumpers made this critter-like level actually good, which is quite the achievement, if the feather didn't make it so trivial. I know I hit Madeline and Darky earlier and their significance as characters because I'm abusive, but this scene after the Darky boss fight, the double dash climb, the Theo Chio Darky scene, the entirety of Chapter 7, and the credits are all a huge payoff for the game that is difficult to explain without first-hand experience in it. It's hard for me to really convey how touching, rewarding, and satisfying it is beyond what I discussed earlier, to see this development, to befriend Darky, and to witness their friendship truly grow throughout the rest of the game. So I won't. Woo! Whoa! The summit! I am pumped! I'm pumped! Let's do this! Ugh. And some of these levels are just so well done too, especially with the springboard that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, that's a good one. What a way to get players pumped for this last chapter. They really succeeded and beyond for having the story being the driving force for the game. Speaking of, I'm glad that Madeline took off her backpack. That definitely needed to happen, and it's a nice touch for Madeline's character. For Chapter 7, we make our way through more difficult levels from every chapter before reaching the final summit levels. So let's briefly discuss these chapters. We begin with some basic introductory levels for the new Double Dash, and with the Chapter 6 theme, but with blue thorns instead of purple. The blue is much more uplifting and thus quite fitting if you ask me. Close to the end, we find a level that has us jumping between these walls, and after a couple tries or so, you might learn to dash underneath to great effect. This is a wonderful example of multiple approaches that slowly kicks in as we retry the level. As we've discussed before, longer levels really shine with this approach in mind. Next, we see the purple orb we used before the Theochio cutscene, which was a great way to establish this orb object so we're not potentially confused when we're in the midst of a climb like this one. The next area, we start back from Chapter 1. I'm going to breeze by here and hit the purple orb level because there's a strange little block here that destroys the pacing for the purple orb ascent. It completely stops us in our tracks. This would have been wonderful in a previous room, but the elements here should be working together to promote movement as much as possible to complement the purple orb's upward force. Back to Chapter 2, we see dream blocks being used to great effect, which is wonderful to see since Chapter 2 was rather lacking in the dream block department. We also begin to see springboards being used on the sides of objects to propel us forward and to extend our airtime. This becomes one of the strongest aspects of the summit later on. Now, what really stinks is this room right here. The dream block above looks like a secret or side path, right? Well, let's zoom out on the map real quick. Apparently going the secret route will miss you out on a strawberry on the very right. Luckily, that's the extent of the poor design regarding the first dream block, because disregarding that 3-2 strawberry on the map, we're actually meant to take the first path, then find the secret strawberry that leads to a whole other area that has a hidden gem. There are 7 gems in Chapter 7, one from each distinct chapter area that are needed for the Chapter 7 Blue Heart. Taking the second dream block instead of the first leads directly to the room, and you miss out on the 3-3 strawberry, which is fine. The problem here is that there's no way to backtrack in case you wanted to go back and explore the first path or the area to the right. The way this entire path is hidden in addition to a strawberry hints that there may be a secret nearby. This is a well-designed path that subtly hints at hiding a gem, but the area itself needed restructuring since taking either the first or second dream block leads to design issues regardless. With that aside, using dream blocks to maintain airtime is a highlight of the dream blocks and is utilized both here and in a nearby room. The purple orb finale has us consistently moving and climbing. This greatly complements the purple orb's utility, so it's a nice and firm finish. Chapter 3. You know, Chapter 3 was pretty good. My main complaint was the critter problem, and that shows its face more in the B-side than otherwise. However, we also see the critter problem come to light in Chapter 7. Whoa, slow down, bucko! We ain't in a rodeo! And just to be clear, a room like this one is fine. Reasonably paced and deliberate pauses. And by that I mean the critters here are turning around, pausing, then moving again. It feels much more purposeful. Not only that, but compare the timings in relation to the music. The first room is much more enjoyable based on the critter timing itself with the beat alone, while the second room simply doesn't have that fun gimmick. Imagine if this room had a beat or any kind of rhythm to follow, it would turn this kinda overwhelming movement into something more predictable and enjoyable. Now, those of you who were naysayers about the critter problem might understand where I'm coming from now. For this level, we have to press the doorbell, then land on this platform, or we can utilize this energy crystal, but that's too trial and error. It also seems like you should be able to do an underpass and skip to the end wall altogether, but that's not possible. Later on in this level, we have to wait to time our critter dash, which is just riveting. Waiting plays a much more significant role here in Chapter 7's hotel compared to the original Chapter 3. As another example, in the very next level, we find ourselves waiting on worms until we can time our jump dashes. This may not seem like a big deal, and it might not be. Maybe you're fine with waiting. I just find it a weak use of critters, similar to how tight spaces was a weak use of feathers. Not to mention, the critters don't follow the beat. Instead of making a level here with depth, they just increased the speed and copy and pasted a few times. Besides that, there actually is a problem here. If the player still doesn't realize that they can stand still on the worms and not trigger depression, then they will be trying to rush this level, and I reckon that's not very good. The purple orb finale is back to Chapter 1's weird pacing, but even worse, since we have to boost ourselves to the left, then horizontally to the right? The purple orb's upward force isn't even being used here as we stay stagnant vertically. Chapter 4 is back, baby, with more levels utilizing Brace the Wind and the concept of struggling against said wind. We then have another snowball wind level that has multiple approaches, Brace the Wind, clear conveyance of dash angles, it's all here. We have more block levels, which is exactly what I wanted, except there's not much block-to-block interaction like that one room in the original Chapter 4. We even have another level with wind pushing us forward. Like I said, I wish there was more of this in the original Chapter 4, but it just didn't fit the story being told. It's only one level here, but it's still nice variety. The gym is right at the beginning, after the first room. You might think this is just a scenic view, but the game doesn't do that, so we have every reason to believe something is hidden here, and there is. Traveling across to find the gym is an environmental journey, figuring out how to proceed when coming across seemingly dead ends. Besides this overly precise jump dash, this gym segment is absolutely ingenious. The purple orb lends itself well here by propelling us higher and higher, from orb to orb, barely touching any ground. Not only that, but the wind has time to stop then shift gears whenever we hit an orb to keep us on our toes. I also like how they had the foresight to change the wind's velocity when hitting the orbs rather than mid-flight. That would be brutally anti-brace the wind. This entire purple orb finale is possibly the best one out of them all because of how well it integrates with the wind, springboards, bubbles, and blocks to maintain airtime or otherwise constant movement. Absolutely beautiful. Chapter 5 is here and it splits itself. Twice, unfortunately. First off, the gym involves trying out random directions for these two red bubbles. The first one leading to a secret, the second leading to a secret within the secret. Both are impossible to find without completely guessing. At least the first one is reasonable though, given this strangely placed curved wall to our left. The second one sets an odd precedent, since this isn't a suspicious beyond doubt illusory wall. Because of that, the precedent could potentially force the player to start hitting every single wall with future red bubbles to try and find secrets. The original Chapter 5 did the secret well, by letting you know there's a red bubble secret, by letting you find a much more obvious button secret. The secret level itself is very clever, needing to trigger the dash platform before the red bubble, bounce off the wall, and then momentum off the dash platform, all in what feels like one fluid motion, leaving both dashes for grabbing the strawberry and then escaping. The gym level is a more straightforward application of the red bubble, energy crystals, dash platforms, and even a red bubble and button combination. Even on the main path, below the secret within a secret, we have some goodies, although you can skip it entirely if you find the secret. First, we have to dash twice, then climb and stand on top of the vertical platform. That's a new application, the perfect learning introduction for Up Ahead, where we have a series of dash platforms, all about positioning, traveling from one to the next, and considering when it's possible to stand on them to refresh ourselves. It's wonderful! Although there's also this short room in between that's just a single momentum jump. We've seen these from Jupiter and back. I can hardly even justify its existence here for the sake of pacing because there's nothing else to it. So thus far, we've seen some nice advancements in the Chapter 5 industry. However, we unfortunately hit a snag, and that would be right below the central room. Oh boy, this is fun! I sure hope a split path doesn't occur that splits the area between an engaging red bubble segment and blades that are positioned between do or die airtime and waiting for a potential opportunity that's difficult to judge. But then Celeste gives me something I wanted for Christmas. More levels integrating buttons, so overall, this Chapter 5 area expanded on its concepts, but clearly started to run out of ideas, so it resorted to saw blades and split paths. The purple orb finale isn't as fluid as the last one, but by golly they tried, such as the springboard foreplay, the dashing and grabbing into a springboard, and momentuming up into wall jumping between move and dash platforms so you couldn't dash without dying, which was just so clever, I love it. And it doesn't even end there. There's an obvious secret here, and the right platform doesn't have thorns on top as another slight hint and an unorthodox platform to use for such a secret. The absolutely fantastic part of this, however, is how you're surprised to find that the strawberry is blocked by a door, and the hidden button above is also blocked. So you hit 2 buttons and collect your prize. There's also a strawberry on the left side to complete the 4 corners imagery going on here. With such a crazy secret, the player is likely to wonder if there's something on the other side as well, at least that's what their intentions were. Finally, the summit. There's a countdown of 30 flags, which is quite fitting for what the game conveys as a monumental achievement. The summit is at its best when we're climbing the side of the mountain. It's at its second best when maintaining airtime with springboards and energy crystals, or overall keeping you on your toes. The summit makes you feel like you're actually climbing the side of a mountain, which is exactly the story they are trying to tell here. The summit is at its worst, and this is easily predictable at this point. When feathers are involved, the feathers exist here to make up for the lack of a legitimate Chapter 6 section, or when a challenge or strawberry is too tight. Let's take flag number 17 for instance. To make it to this endpoint, we have to barely grab the very edge, and that's also considering I gained as much leeway as possible. So as I've already said, climbing the side of the mountain is the best feeling we can experience in this final ascent. For most of the mountain climb, there's a light updraft that keeps us afloat longer, and that really helps with keeping us airborne throughout this chapter, and thus the level design can take advantage of this to emphasize climbing on the side of a mountain. Let's take this group of flags for instance. We don't need the updraft per se, but this way the level design can spread itself out more so it doesn't feel too congested, and it gives us enough room to maneuver since the majority of time spent here is in the air and wall grabbing. Since the level design is more spread out, we get a better sense of scale. And then this section moves us to what feels like the side of the mountain yet again, involving the fantastic use of springboards. But unfortunately, this flag number 10 ends on a sour note with a small little U-shaped obstacle. The way it's shaped makes it look like we're supposed to dash up on the other side, and we can't dash horizontally first since we only have 1 dash left. What we're supposed to do is enter and leave diagonally, which is something I eventually found out by trial and error, because there's no visual guidance here whatsoever. Sure, there's a subtle dip at the bottom, but these vertical columns of thorns suggest otherwise. In either case, the summit is an extraordinarily strong finish to Celeste and has some of the best levels in the game, because when the summit works, it works. It really. The perfect way to summarize Chapter 7 is the strawberries and the purple orb levels. Bet you didn't see that one coming. The very first level has a gem hidden next to the purple orb. Every orb level thereafter has a hidden strawberry near the top, except Chapter 3 has none and Chapter 5 has 3. It's like the game is omitting its best and worst chapters. I didn't even have to make this video, Matt Thorson already did it for me. In all seriousness though, the wonderful part about Celeste is how there aren't any overall bad chapters. Sometimes ideas are taken too far, sometimes not far enough. The story and narrative takes the forefront and shaped and molded the game to its benefit despite the aforementioned faults. Some ideas they used well without realizing why it works here and not in other places. New concepts always intertwine to provide new experiences, constantly, and many of these concepts were properly utilized to gain the most satisfaction out of the execution. Precedents were set right at the beginning of the game to make sure the player knew what to expect, and so an emphasis was placed on being observant. The overwhelming majority of Celeste doesn't require any outside sources or guides, and that's an achievement on its own. I almost never wondered which path was the main or side path, and if a new concept had to be introduced to make sure of that, then it was done. The story being the driving force behind each chapter helped put the player in her shoes, such as removing strawberries, or the lengthier levels that were used sparingly to emphasize story events or stress. Lengthier levels were pulled off extraordinarily well because they were properly planned for beyond the aforementioned story purpose. And finally, multiple approaches and generosity is ultimately the foundation of Celeste, and I would argue that's why we can consider it one of the best 2D platformers ever made. If you made it through this analysis, thank you. From the bottom of my blue heart, it truly means everything to me, and I hope to continue doing this with your support. I'm gonna make these final comments quick, so please stick around for a few moments since this might interest you. First of all, I read my comments, so I appreciate constructive criticism or feedback, or you can tell me your favorite chapter or concept and why. I think that's a pretty difficult question. Despite my chapter 5 is the best chapter joke earlier, and chapter 5 was actually my favorite chapter initially. After this video, I honestly don't know if I have one. I'm curious about your thoughts, so tell me. Please subscribe if you want to see more ridiculously in-depth game analysis videos. You may have noticed I didn't talk about Chapter 8 or the B-sides, even though earlier I said I was going to mention the B-sides. That was before I reached the end of producing this video. The B-sides are something that's simply out of this video's scope, which is funny to say considering this video's length, but believe me, I could have easily talked about every single level in this entire game, which is why the Chapter 1 segment of this video is the longest, because I did just that, on top of establishing what Celeste was all about. So, if you're interested in a B-side video, including Chapter 8, or perhaps a separate Chapter 8 video, I have no clue, let me know. Same goes with any game I analyze that has DLC or bonus content. It's not gonna happen unless I see enough requests of it. This video took me months of continuous work on top of a full-time job. Speaking of full-time job, a Patreon is how I will make this channel my full-time job if you want to support me. Thank you to my $3 and higher patrons. I will forever be grateful for your trust in me and my content. I can't wait to interact with more of you. It's exciting times. Speaking of interacting, the screen will have my Discord URL that will not be in the description. Come join us. So that's that, I guess. Thanks for sticking around. Here are other people's videos that I'm recommending.
Corvus, Corvus, Corvus Dominus Deus Sabaoth, venis ungelia terra gloria tua, Hosanna in excelsis, benedictus qui venit in nomine Domini, Hosanna.